Imagine standing at the edge of the known world 2,000 years ago, gazing out at an empire that stretched from the rainy highlands of Britain to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, an empire so vast and powerful that it seemed no force on earth could challenge its dominance. Yet hidden within the shadows of this colossal power were pockets of fierce independence, kingdoms and cultures that looked Rome in the eye and said, "You will not conquer us." These were the last kingdoms to resist Roman rule, and their stories are some of history's most gripping sagas of defiance, ingenuity, and mystery. For centuries, they held out against the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever known, using everything from guerrilla warfare in misty forests to clever diplomacy in sprawling deserts. They were the final holdouts, the stubborn few who refused to vanish quietly into the pages of history until, one by one, they did. What made these societies so resilient? How did they manage to stall, and in some cases, even humiliate an empire that had subjugated nearly the entire Mediterranean world? And why, after centuries of resistance, did they ultimately disappear, leaving behind only whispers and ruins for us to decipher? These questions tug at the very heart of what it means to resist, to adapt, and to endure. From the rugged warriors of Caledonia to the ingenious traders of Petra, these kingdoms weren't just footnotes in Rome's story. They were vibrant, complex civilizations with their own dreams, their own gods, and their own unshakable will to remain free. Their struggles echo across time, reminding us that even in the face of overwhelming force, the human spirit can find astonishing ways to push back. In this video, we're setting out on a journey to uncover the secrets of these lost kingdoms. We'll walk in the footsteps of their people, explore the strategic choices that kept Rome at bay for generations, and piece together the clues that explain their sudden or gradual vanishings. Along the way, we'll meet charismatic leaders who inspired their people to near impossible feats, examine the environmental and economic pressures that shaped their fates, and discover how their legacies live on in unexpected ways in our languages, our cultures, and our understanding of resilience itself. This isn't just a story about ancient conflicts. It's a reflection on what endures when empires fade and why some voices, though silenced for centuries, never truly disappear. So settle in. We're about to travel back in time to explore the last kingdoms to resist Roman rule and the haunting question of why they vanished. To truly appreciate the stories of those final holdouts defying Rome centuries later, we must first travel back to the very beginning to witness the origins of this relentless drive for expansion. The Roman Republic, and later the Empire, did not emerge fully formed as a Mediterranean superpower. Its journey began on a much smaller scale, right there on the Italian peninsula. For centuries, Rome was just one city-state among many, locked in a fierce struggle for survival and supremacy against its neighbors. It was in these early, gritty conflicts that the Roman military machine was forged and tempered. They learned the art of war not from textbooks, but from hard-fought battles against determined rivals like the Samnites, a confederation of hardy hill tribes from the central Apennines. The Samnite Wars were brutal affairs, fought across difficult mountainous terrain that negated the Romans' initial preference for orderly, set-piece battles. The Samnites, masters of guerrilla tactics and ambushes, handed Rome some of its most humiliating early defeats, such as the infamous disaster at the Caudine Forks, where an entire Roman army was forced to surrender and march under the yoke, a profound and lasting symbol of shame. Yet with each setback, Rome adapted. They learned to fight on unfamiliar ground. They absorbed new weapons and tactics from their enemies, and they developed an unparalleled resilience, a refusal to ever accept permanent defeat. This pattern of adaptation became a cornerstone of their future success. Meanwhile, to the north, the Celtic tribes known to the Romans as Gauls presented a different kind of challenge. Their fierce warrior culture and terrifying initial assaults, including the legendary sack of Rome itself in the 4th century B.C., left a deep psychological scar on the Roman psyche. The image of the wild, towering Gaulish warrior became synonymous with the barbarian threat at the gates, a constant reminder of the perils that lay beyond the sphere of Roman control. Confronting these early opponents taught Rome two crucial, parallel lessons that would define its imperial policy for the next 500 years. First, they learned the absolute necessity of overwhelming force and meticulous organization, the power of the legion, the discipline of the soldier, and the unbreakable will to pursue victory at any cost. But second, and just as importantly, they learned the power of assimilation. Unlike many conquerors who simply plunder and move on, Rome began to integrate defeated peoples. They offered pathways to citizenship, co-opted local elites, and absorbed foreign deities into their own pantheon. This dual strategy of the sword and the olive branch became their blueprint for empire. By the time Rome's gaze turned beyond Italy to the glittering civilizations of Carthage, Greece, and the Hellenistic East, it was no longer just a powerful city. It was an unstoppable force, a system of expansion refined in the fiery crucible of early Italian resistance. Every battle against the Samnites, every clash with the Gauls, was a rehearsal for the epic confrontations to come, providing the essential context for understanding how a relatively small city on the Tiber River could eventually inspire both awe and bitter defiance across the entire known world. So what defined these final holdouts, these stubborn kingdoms that refused to bend the knee when so many others had fallen? It's a fascinating question because the answer is far more nuanced than simply being the last ones on the map to be conquered. Timing was a factor, of course, but the true essence of their defiance lay in a powerful combination of three key ingredients: formidable geography, an unbreakable cultural spirit, and sheer strategic brilliance. These weren't just random territories, they were often natural fortresses. Imagine the impenetrable misty highlands of Caledonia, where every glen and mountain pass offered a perfect ambush point against the rigid formations of a Roman legion. Or picture the vast, sun-scorched emptiness of the Sahara, where the Garamantes knew every hidden oasis and sand dune, turning the desert itself into a shield against invasion. Then there were the Nabataeans, who carved their magnificent capital, Petra, directly into towering rose-red cliffs, a city that was both a thriving trade hub and a seemingly impregnable stronghold. This difficult terrain was their first and greatest ally, forcing Rome to fight on terms that negated its overwhelming advantages in numbers and discipline. But a remote location alone wasn't enough. What truly sustained these kingdoms was a deep, fierce sense of cultural identity that was utterly distinct from the Roman way of life. For the Caledonians, their identity was woven into the very land they defended, a warrior ethos celebrated in song, and a spiritual connection to their druidic traditions that Rome could never understand or assimilate. The Garamantes, thriving in the depths of the desert, had developed a unique and sophisticated civilization centered around incredible feats of engineering like their underground irrigation systems, which allowed them to flourish in isolation. The Nabataeans possessed a masterful understanding of trade and commerce, controlling the lucrative incense routes and creating a wealthy, cosmopolitan society that valued its independence above all else. This powerful cultural distinctiveness meant that submission to Rome wasn't just a political defeat. it would have been a form of cultural suicide, a complete erasure of who they were as a people. This profound stakes fueled a resilience that ordinary kingdoms simply couldn't muster. Their methods of resistance were as varied as their landscapes. Some, like the Caledonians, relied on outright military confrontation, honing guerrilla tactics that harassed and exhausted the legions. Others became masters of a delicate diplomatic dance. The Nabataeans, for instance, expertly navigated the politics of the region, initially acting as valuable allies to Rome, useful intermediaries for trade before gradually finding their autonomy slipping away as the empire's grip tightened. Sometimes sheer luck played a role. A rebellion elsewhere in the empire might suddenly draw away Roman forces, or a period of internal instability in Rome could provide a crucial decades-long window to consolidate power and fortify defenses. Ultimately, being one of the last kingdoms meant possessing a rare alchemy of these elements, a land that was difficult to hold, a people who were impossible to subdue in spirit, and the cleverness to exploit every possible advantage. They were the ultimate survivors of the ancient world, and their stories offer us a captivating look at the limits of even history's most powerful empires. Now let's turn our gaze north to the wild and rain-swept highlands the Romans called Caledonia, a land that would become a symbol of fierce, unyielding resistance. This was not a single, unified kingdom in the way we might imagine, but rather a collection of tribes, including the Caledonians themselves and the Picts, bound together by a shared culture and an even more powerful shared enemy. Their greatest advantage was the land itself. Imagine the Roman legions, accustomed to the open battlefields of Gaul or the sunny coasts of Greece, suddenly thrust into a world of endless mist, treacherous bogs, and dense, ancient forests. Every narrow glen was a potential death trap, every hillock a hiding place for ambush. The Caledonian warriors mastered the art of the swift, sharp attack, striking the disciplined Roman lines with terrifying speed before melting back into the impenetrable landscape. They refused to meet Rome on its own terms, understanding that in a straightforward, set-piece battle, the legions were invincible. Their warfare was one of attrition and exhaustion, designed to make the cost of conquest so unbearably high that Rome would eventually just give up. At the heart of this resistance was a profound spiritual and cultural connection to their homeland. This wasn't just about defending territory, it was about defending a way of life. Their society was steeped in Druidic traditions, with a deep reverence for the natural world that stood in stark contrast to Rome's ordered, urban-centric view of civilization. Their warriors fought not for an emperor or a distant capital, but for their clan, their chieftain, and the very soil their ancestors were buried in. This warrior ethos was celebrated in song and story, creating a powerful cultural identity that Roman offers of assimilation could not easily break. The Romans, for all their military might, were struggling against something far more powerful than an army. They were fighting against a spirit. This clash of spirit and steel came to a head at the Battle of Marn's Gropius in the year 83 AD. The Roman historian Tacitus gives us our only account, painting a dramatic picture of the event, though we must remember he was writing to glorify his father-in-law, the Roman general Agricola. According to him, the Caledonians, led by the chieftain Calgacus, faced the Romans on the field. Tacitus even puts a stirring speech in Calgacus's mouth, where he famously decries the Romans as creators of a desolation and calling it peace. The battle itself was a brutal affair. The Caledonians, though fighting with incredible bravery, were ultimately overwhelmed by the superior discipline, armor, and tactics of the Roman army. Thousands were said to have fallen, yet even in this decisive defeat, their resistance was not broken. They simply retreated back into their highland fortresses, and the land itself once again became their shield. The Romans won the battle, but they could not hold the land. They built a series of forts to try and contain the threat, but maintaining a permanent presence in such hostile territory proved a logistical nightmare. Eventually, they fell back to what would become Hadrian's Wall, effectively drawing a border and admitting that Caledonia was a land they could not truly tame. The legacy of the Caledonians did not vanish with the Roman Empire. Their story of defiance against a vastly more powerful southern invader became a foundational myth for Scotland, echoing through the centuries in later struggles for independence. The image of the hardy Highlander, fiercely protective of his freedom and his home, is a direct descendant of those ancient tribes who looked at the greatest empire on earth and said no. They were the guardians of the North, and though their names and specific deeds are mostly lost to time, their spirit of resistance became an indelible part of the identity of a nation, a powerful reminder that sometimes the most difficult terrain to conquer is not the land itself, but the will of the people who live there. Now let's journey far from the misty highlands to a world of relentless sun and shifting sands, to meet a civilization that turned the Sahara desert itself into a fortress. The Garamantes present a fascinating counterpoint to the Caledonians. Where the northern tribes used overt military defiance, the Garamantes mastered a more subtle art of resistance. They became untouchable. Their kingdom lay in the Fezzan region of modern-day Libya, deep in the heart of what is now the world's largest hot desert. To the Romans gazing south from their coastal cities, this was a terrifying and empty wasteland, a realm of demons and certain death. But for the Garamantes, it was home, and they possessed the ingenious knowledge to not just survive there, but to thrive spectacularly. Their entire society was built upon a breathtaking feat of engineering known as the Fagara or Canat system. This was not simple irrigation. It was a lifeline carved into the earth. They tunneled deep underground, sometimes for miles, to tap into ancient fossil water aquifers that had been sealed beneath the rock for millennia. These tunnels would slope gently upwards, allowing water to flow by gravity to the surface, where it was channeled to irrigate vast fields of wheat, barley, dates, and grapes. What appeared to the outside world as a barren hellscape was, in reality, a hidden network of lush, green oases, a verdant archipelago in a sea of sand. This agricultural surplus was the foundation of everything. It supported sizable towns, a stratified society with kings and artisans, and a powerful military force that could patrol their vast domain. Their resistance to Rome was economic and geographical, not military. They understood that the desert was their greatest army, a Roman legion burdened with heavy armor and reliant on long supply chains would face a nightmarish march into nothingness. The Garamantian warriors, by contrast, were masters of the desert. Mounted on agile horses and later camels, they could appear as if from nowhere, launch a swift attack on any would-be invader, and vanish back into the shimmering haze before a proper counterattack could even be organized. They didn't need to defeat the Roman army in battle. They simply made the cost of an invasion so astronomically high and the chances of success so vanishingly small that Rome never seriously attempted it. Instead, the empires reached an uneasy understanding. The Garamantes controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes, the only paths through which coveted goods like gold, ivory, exotic animals, and salt could travel from sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean coast. The Romans needed these goods, and the Garamantes became the indispensable middlemen, amassing great wealth and maintaining their independence by controlling something Rome desperately wanted but could not take by force. Yet, for all their ingenuity, the Garamantes ultimately fell victim to the very environment they had so brilliantly mastered. Their magnificent Fagara system had a critical flaw. It relied on a finite resource. The ancient aquifers they tapped were not being replenished. They were mining water that had been trapped for thousands of years. Slowly, inevitably, the water tables began to drop. Maintaining the tunnels became harder, and some began to dry up or collapse. This was likely exacerbated by a gradual shift in the climate, making the region even more arid. Their agricultural base, the very core of their power, began to shrink. As their wealth and influence waned, they became more vulnerable. When the Romans finally did push further south with more confidence in later centuries, they encountered a civilization already in decline, its resilience sapped not by legions, but by the silent draining of its lifeblood. The story of the Garamantes is a profound lesson in sustainability. It shows us that a civilization can be brilliantly adaptive and seemingly unconquerable, yet still face collapse from within if its relationship with the environment is based on consumption rather than renewal. They didn't vanish in a blaze of glory against a foreign enemy. They faded away as the wells ran dry and the sands slowly reclaimed their green and pleasant lands. From the harsh deserts of the Sahara, we now travel to the equally arid but dramatically different landscape of the rocky Arabian deserts, where the Nabataeans performed a kind of magic. They didn't just survive in this unforgiving environment. They conjured a breathtaking civilization from the very cliffs and canyons, building their legendary capital, Petra, a city that remains one of the most awe-inspiring archaeological sites on Earth. The first thing you must understand about the Nabataeans is that their entire existence was a masterclass in turning apparent weakness into overwhelming strength. Their homeland had little water and no vast fields for farming, but it had something far more valuable: location. They planted themselves directly atop the most lucrative trade routes of the ancient world, the superhighways for incense. Frankincense and myrrh, harvested from the remote trees of southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, were not just pleasant perfumes, they were essentials of ancient life, used in religious ceremonies across the Mediterranean, in funeral rites, and as coveted medicines. This trade was the lifeblood of empires, and the Nabataeans became its indispensable guardians. Their genius lay in control without outright ownership. They didn't necessarily produce these goods themselves, but they commanded the routes they traveled on. Caravans of thousands of camels, laden with unimaginable wealth, had to pass through the territory the Nabataeans dominated. For a price, these merchants received protection, water, and safe passage. The Nabataeans essentially built a toll-based economy on a continental scale, amassing enormous wealth that allowed them to build a kingdom in the most improbable of places. And this is where their second, and perhaps greatest, genius reveals itself: hydraulic engineering. A city of Petra's size, supporting tens of thousands of people, required a staggering amount of water in a region that might see flash floods followed by months of drought. The Nabataeans were brilliant water managers. They constructed an intricate, city-wide network of dams, cisterns, and terracotta pipes that captured every precious drop of rainwater, channeled destructive flash floods into containment systems, and stored enough water to see the population through long dry periods. This system was so advanced that it put many Roman cities to shame. With wealth and water secured, they turned to their most lasting legacy: architecture. Instead of building structures up from the ground, they carved them directly down into the vibrant red, pink, and orange sandstone cliffs. The most famous of these, the Treasury or Al-Kosne, is a breathtaking facade hewn directly from the rock face, its Hellenistic-style columns and statues standing as a testament to their artistic skill and their connections to the wider Greco-Roman world. But Petra was far more than just one beautiful building. It was an entire city of tombs, temples, and houses carved into the mountain, a sprawling urban center that showcased their unique blend of local tradition and international influence. For centuries, this combination of economic indispensability, diplomatic savvy, and geographical remoteness allowed the Nabataeans to navigate the treacherous politics of the region. They skillfully played powerful neighbors like the Ptolemaic Egyptians and the Seleucids against each other, often positioning themselves as useful client allies to the rising power of Rome. They maintained a formal independence even as the Roman Empire swallowed every kingdom around them. However, this delicate balancing act could not last forever. By the 1st century AD, Rome's grip on the East was tightening. The old model of having a friendly buffer state like Nabataea became less appealing to an empire that now demanded direct control and efficient tax collection. The lucrative trade routes that were the source of Nabataean wealth were simply too tempting for Rome to leave in the hands of a middleman. The exact circumstances are still debated by historians, but in the year 106 AD, the Emperor Trajan formally annexed the Nabataean kingdom, transforming it into the Roman province of Arabia Petrea. There appears to have been little military conflict, suggesting the Nabataeans saw the inevitable and acquiesced, perhaps negotiating terms for their elite. Their disappearance as an independent political entity was quiet, almost administrative, but to say they vanished would be a profound mistake. Their legacy was absorbed directly into the Roman world. The incredible water management techniques they pioneered were studied and adopted by Roman engineers, influencing infrastructure projects across the empire. The bustling trade they had managed now flowed directly into Roman coffers, financing even greater imperial ambitions. The Nabataeans teach us a powerful lesson about resilience. Their story isn't one of a glorious last stand, but of a different kind of endurance, the endurance of ideas. They demonstrated that innovation and adaptation can be just as effective as military might in preserving a culture's influence long after its political autonomy has faded. While the Nabataeans used economic leverage and the Garamantes relied on the desert itself, the kingdom of Dacia presented Rome with a far more direct and tantalizing threat, one forged not in sand but in the glittering depths of the earth. Nestled within the formidable arc of the Carpathian Mountains, in what is now modern-day Romania, Dacia was a land of immense natural wealth and fierce warrior pride. Its heart pulsed with gold, an abundance so legendary it became the stuff of Roman obsession. This wasn't just a wealthy kingdom, it was a treasure chest guarded by some of the most skilled and determined fighters in Europe. And for Rome, that combination made it an irresistible target. The Dacians were not mere barbarians to be pushed aside. They were a sophisticated, organized power, a genuine rival empire that commanded respect and ultimately fear from the Roman legions. The rise of Dacia as a unified threat was catalyzed by the visionary leadership of two extraordinary kings. The first was Burebista, who in the 1st century BC united the various Dacian tribes into a single, powerful kingdom that stretched from the Black Sea to the edge of modern-day Slovakia. Under his rule, Dacia became a regional superpower, one that even the late Roman Republic under Julius Caesar viewed with cautious respect. Burebista's death led to a period of fragmentation, but the flame of a unified Dacia was rekindled by a figure who would become Rome's most formidable nemesis in the region, King Decebalus. He was a leader of immense charisma, political cunning, and military genius. Decebalus understood that to survive next to the Roman behemoth, he needed more than just brave warriors. He fortified the mountain passes with a system of stone citadels so advanced that they still impress archaeologists today. He reorganized the army, equipping his soldiers with a terrifying, curved weapon called the falx, a two-handed scythe-like blade that could slice through Roman shields and helmets with gruesome efficiency. Most importantly, he used Dacia's vast gold reserves to fund his defenses and to buy alliances with neighboring tribes, creating a buffer zone of resistance around his mountain core. For Rome, Dacia was a dual problem, a military threat and an economic prize. The Dacians were not content to stay in their mountains. Under Decebalus, they launched raids across the Danube into the Roman province of Moesia, inflicting humiliating defeats and carrying off loot and prisoners. This was an insult the empire could not abide, but more than pride, it was the gold that drew Rome's hungry gaze. The extensive mines in the Apuseni Mountains represented a financial solution to many of Rome's problems. Emperor Domitian launched a campaign against Decebalus, but it ended in a stinging, embarrassing peace treaty that actually saw Rome paying tribute to the Dacian king, a temporary measure that bought Decebalus time to grow even stronger. This perceived humiliation demanded a final, decisive response. That response came from one of Rome's most ambitious emperors, Trajan. The Dacian Wars, fought between 101 and 106 AD, were not minor border skirmishes. They were among the largest, most costly, and most brutal military operations the Roman Empire ever undertook. Trajan committed a massive force, perhaps as many as 11 legions plus auxiliaries, over 100,000 men. He even had his chief architect, Apollodorus of Damascus, build a monumental stone bridge across the Danube to facilitate the invasion, a staggering feat of engineering that stood for centuries. The war was a grueling campaign of attrition. The Romans had to fight their way through fortified mountain pass after fortified mountain pass, facing not only the fierce Dacian warriors and their deadly falxes, but also a form of psychological warfare. The Dacians' devotion to their god Zalmoxis and their belief in an afterlife gave them a fearlessness in battle that unnerved the superstitious legionaries. The climax of the conflict was the siege of the Dacian capital, Sarmizegetusa Regia. Perched high in the mountains, it was both a spiritual center and a formidable fortress. After a long and bloody siege, the city fell. Rather than be captured and paraded through Rome in chains, King Decebalus took his own life. His death marked the end of organized Dacian resistance. The aftermath was total and devastating. To ensure Dacia could never rise again, the Romans systematically destroyed Sarmizegetusa and other major fortresses. They then embarked on a campaign of ruthless exploitation, pouring into the region to plunder its legendary wealth. The amount of gold and silver extracted was so colossal it funded Trajan's vast building projects in Rome, including his famous Forum, and stabilized the Roman economy for years. To solidify their hold, the Romans encouraged massive colonization, drawing settlers from across the empire to farm the land and work the mines, forever changing the region's demographics. Yet for all this systematic destruction and assimilation, the Dacian spirit did not completely vanish. They left an indelible mark on the land and its people. While Latin became the dominant language, forming the basis of modern Romanian, linguists have identified a core vocabulary of perhaps a few hundred words of Dacian origin that survived, often related to the natural world, plants, animals, and rural life. Their spiritual beliefs and folklore subtly intertwined with those of the Roman settlers and later influences, creating a unique cultural tapestry. The story of the Dacians is a powerful and poignant lesson in the paradox of resource wealth. Their gold gave them the power to build a civilization strong enough to defy Rome for decades, but it was that very same gold that made their destruction inevitable. They were ultimately conquered not because they were weak, but because they were too rich, and their defiance serves as a timeless reminder that great treasure often attracts even greater danger. While the Dacians fought for gold and the Garamantes for their desert oasis, the struggle in Judea was of an entirely different nature. Here, resistance was not merely a matter of politics or territory. It was a profound, all-consuming battle for the soul, a holy war fought with the unshakable conviction that their faith and their God demanded nothing less than absolute freedom from idolatrous oppressors. The Roman occupation of Judea was a constant, grating insult to Jewish religious sensibilities. The presence of pagan symbols, the heavy-handed tax collectors, and perhaps most provocatively, the placement of Roman standards bearing the emperor's image in Jerusalem, a direct violation of the prohibition against graven images, created a simmering cauldron of resentment. This was not a clash of two armies, but a collision of two utterly incompatible worldviews, a polytheistic empire that demanded political submission and a monotheistic people for whom submission to any power but God was the ultimate blasphemy. This powder keg finally exploded in the year 66 AD, igniting what we now call the Great Revolt. The initial spark was a dispute over funds in the city of Caesarea, but it rapidly spread into a full-blown national uprising. Jewish zealots, a faction known for their militant and uncompromising stance, successfully drove the Roman garrison out of Jerusalem. For a brief, euphoric moment, it seemed as if divine intervention was at hand. The Jews established their own independent government and minted coins proclaiming their freedom. But the Roman response when it came was swift, brutal, and methodical. Emperor Nero dispatched his finest general, Vespasian, with a force of 60,000 seasoned legionaries. Vespasian's campaign was a masterclass in ruthless pacification. He did not march directly on Jerusalem. Instead, he spent years systematically crushing resistance in the Galilee and the countryside, town by town, village by village, slowly strangling the rebellion and isolating its heart. It is from this campaign that we get one of history's most fascinating and complex sources, the Jewish historian Josephus, a former commander of the Galilean forces. He was captured by the Romans after the fall of the fortress of Jotapata. Facing execution, he famously prophesied that Vespasian would become emperor, a prediction that ultimately saved his life and earned him a place in the Roman court. As Flavius Josephus, he wrote The Jewish War, a detailed account of the conflict that is both invaluable and deeply problematic. As a defector writing for a Roman audience, his narrative often justifies Roman actions while simultaneously expressing grief for his people's suffering, making him a perpetual figure of controversy, a symbol of both historical preservation and collaboration. The climax of the war was the siege of Jerusalem itself, now led by Vespasian's son, Titus, after his father returned to Rome to claim the imperial throne. The year-long siege that began in 70 AD was one of the most horrific in ancient history. The city, packed with pilgrims for Passover, quickly descended into famine and then into a nightmare of internal factional violence between different Jewish groups, even as the Roman legions built siege walls and ramparts outside. Titus's forces finally breached the defenses, and what followed was a massacre. The magnificent Second Temple, the center of Jewish religious life for centuries, was looted and set ablaze. The event was so catastrophic that its date on the Hebrew calendar, the 9th of Av, remains a day of mourning and fasting in Judaism to this day. The revolt's final stand occurred at the mountain fortress of Masada, where a group of Sicarii zealots held out for 3 years after Jerusalem's fall, choosing mass suicide over surrender when the Roman siege ramps finally reached the summit. The defeat was total. Jerusalem was left in ruins, and thousands of Jews were killed or sold into slavery, beginning a diaspora that would scatter their people across the globe for nearly 2 millennia. Yet, the embers of defiance were not fully extinguished. 6 decades later, another figure arose who would channel the people's enduring longing for liberation into a second, explosive uprising: Simon Bar Kokhba. Where the Great Revolt had been a broad-based national rebellion, the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 136 AD was a more organized, militarized insurgency. Its leader was a charismatic and formidable warrior whom many, including the revered Rabbi Akiva, believed to be the Messiah, the long-awaited anointed one who would finally restore the kingdom of Israel. The revolt was likely sparked by Emperor Hadrian's plans to rebuild Jerusalem as a Roman pagan city, Aelia Capitolina, and his ban on Jewish religious practices like circumcision, a direct assault on their covenant with God. For 3 years, Bar Kokhba's guerrilla fighters waged a devastating war against the Romans from hidden cave complexes in the Judean hills. They were so effective that they actually managed to liberate Jerusalem and establish an independent state for a short period, even minting their own coins inscribed with phrases like, "For the freedom of Jerusalem." The Roman response, however, was even more overwhelming than before. Hadrian was forced to recall his best general, Julius Severus, from Britain, along with a significant portion of the empire's military might. The campaign to crush the revolt was so brutal and costly that Hadrian, in his report to the Roman Senate, omitted the customary opening phrase, "I and my army are well." The final strongholds were systematically eliminated, and by 136 AD, Judea was utterly desolate. Hadrian executed Bar Kokhba, wiped Jerusalem from the map, and renamed the province Syria Palestina, in a deliberate attempt to sever the Jewish people's connection to their land. The consequences of these two revolts were earth-shattering and permanent. For the Jewish people, it meant the loss of their homeland, their temple, and the center of their spiritual life. It forced a radical transformation of their faith from one centered on temple sacrifice to one built around rabbinical study, prayer, and the synagogue, an adaptation that ultimately ensured their survival as a distinct people in exile. For Rome, the revolts were a shocking lesson in the limits of power. They demonstrated that a people motivated by a deep, unifying faith could not be subdued by military force alone. This hard-won understanding led to a shift in Roman policy, prompting a more cautious and sometimes even accommodating approach toward other religious minorities, as they learned the high cost of provoking a truly devout population. The story of the Jewish revolts stands as history's most powerful testament to the fact that the strongest fortress is not made of stone and mortar, but of faith and conviction. While the Jewish revolts were driven by an unbreakable faith and the Dacians by their mountain fortresses and gold, the story of Armenia presents a different kind of resistance, one fought not on open battlefields, but in the intricate and treacherous halls of diplomacy. Imagine a kingdom perpetually walking a tightrope, with the colossal Roman Empire on one side and the mighty Parthian Empire, and later Sasanian Persia on the other. Armenia's entire history during this period was defined by its precarious geography, a vital buffer zone that both superpowers desperately wanted to control, but neither could afford to see fall completely into the hands of the other. This delicate balance was both Armenia's greatest weapon and its most persistent curse. It allowed for periods of stunning independence and expansion, but it also meant that Armenian kings were forever forced to play a dangerous game of allegiance, switching sides with the shifting winds of power to avoid being crushed between them. The pinnacle of Armenian power and the ultimate expression of what it could achieve through shrewd strategy came during the reign of one of its most celebrated rulers, Tigranes the Great, in the 1st century BC. For a brief, glorious moment, the tightrope walker became the master of the arena. Through a combination of military conquest and strategic marriage, he wedded the daughter of King Mithridates VI of Pontus. Another formidable enemy of Rome, Tigranes assembled a short-lived empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean, even briefly encompassing parts of Syria and Lebanon. He built a new, magnificent capital, Tigranocerta, which became a vibrant, Hellenistic-style center of culture and trade, proudly proclaiming his kingdom's arrival as a major power. He even took the grandiose title of King of Kings, a direct challenge to both Roman and Parthian supremacy. For a time, Armenia was not a pawn but a player, the dominant force in the region. This golden age, however, inevitably drew the hostile gaze of Rome. The Republic, under the command of the general Lucullus, first marched against Tigranes, and while he scored some initial victories, the relentless pressure eventually told. The final blow came from Pompey the Great, who forced Tigranes into a humiliating submission. He was allowed to keep his core kingdom of Armenia itself, but his vast empire was stripped away, reduced once more to its role as a buffer state. This pattern would define the next several centuries. Armenian rulers became masters of realpolitik, expertly gauging the strength of their two immense neighbors. A king might be crowned by the Roman emperor as a client ruler, only to later seek validation from the Parthian Shah to counterbalance Roman influence. The Armenian nobility itself was often divided into pro-Roman and pro-Parthian factions, creating a volatile internal political landscape that mirrored the external struggle. The ultimate symbol of this precarious existence was the Arsacid dynasty, a branch of the ruling Parthian royal family, which was placed on the Armenian throne. This created a fascinating and inherently unstable situation. The king of Armenia was often a close relative of the Parthian Shah, yet he was officially a Roman client. He was constantly pulled in two directions by blood and by treaty, a living embodiment of his kingdom's divided loyalties. This delicate system worked for a surprisingly long time because it served the interests of both empires. A neutral, semi-independent Armenia acted as a crucial cushion, preventing their armies from clashing directly along a vast and vulnerable frontier. It was far cheaper and more stable to influence a buffer state than to occupy it outright and face perpetual rebellion. This fragile equilibrium finally shattered in the 4th century AD for two primary reasons: the rise of a new, far more zealous Persian power and the conversion of Armenia to Christianity. The Parthian Empire was overthrown by the far more centralized and aggressively Zoroastrian Sasanian dynasty, which had much less patience for Armenian autonomy. At almost the exact same time, around the year 301 AD, Armenia made a decision that would forever define its national identity. Under King Tiridates III and the efforts of Saint Gregory the Illuminator, it became the first state in the world to adopt Christianity as its official religion. This was a tectonic shift. It wasn't just a change of gods, it was a fundamental realignment of Armenia's cultural and political compass. Where they had once shared some cultural and religious similarities with their Persian neighbors, they now had a profound spiritual kinship with the Roman Empire, which under Constantine was also embracing Christianity. This new religious divide made the old diplomatic game impossible. The Sasanians saw Christian Armenia not as a neutral buffer, but as a heretical extension of the Roman world, a fifth column in their backyard. They launched relentless campaigns to force the Armenians to revert to Zoroastrianism, sparking a new form of resistance that was both national and deeply religious. The struggle was no longer just about political independence, it was a fight for the very soul of the nation. Despite legendary stands and immense sacrifice, the external pressures proved too great. In 387 AD, the two empires finally carved up the kingdom of Armenia between them, with the larger eastern portion falling under Sasanian influence and a smaller western portion becoming a Roman province. Yet, in a profound twist of history, this political extinction did not lead to cultural death. In fact, it had the opposite effect. The loss of their kingdom forged a new, unbreakable bond between Armenian identity and the Christian faith. To preserve their unique culture and religion under foreign rule, the monk Mesrop Mashtots invented the Armenian alphabet around 405 AD. This was a revolutionary act of defiance. It allowed them to translate the Bible and other religious texts into their own language, creating a vast literary tradition that became the bedrock of their national survival. Their church became the central institution holding the people together, a guardian of their language, culture, and spirit for centuries without a state. Armenia's story teaches us that for a buffer state, survival is not always measured in political independence. Sometimes, the greatest resistance is cultural, ensuring that even when an empire draws a new line on a map, it cannot erase the identity of a people who have learned to endure at the crossroads of history. While the Romans may have claimed victory in southern Britain, establishing their bustling provincial capital at Londinium and building their famous network of straight roads, their control over the entire island was always an illusion. North and west of their comfortable villas and orderly towns lay a different world, a land of misty mountains, deep forests, and rugged coastlines where the authority of the emperor meant very little. Here, tribes like the Picts in the far north and the Celtic peoples in the mountainous regions of Wales and the southwestern peninsula of Cornwall dug in their heels, refusing to surrender their way of life to the Roman machine. Their resistance was not one of massive, set-piece battles, but a sustained, grinding campaign of defiance that would force Rome to literally build a wall and admit it could go no further. These communities understood that their greatest allies were the very landscapes they called home. The impenetrable forests of Wales provided perfect cover for ambushes. The treacherous bogs and steep glens of the Scottish highlands slowed Roman legions to a crawl, and the rocky, isolated coves of Cornwall were nearly impossible to patrol from the land or sea. This intimate knowledge of the terrain turned every advance into a potential death trap for the heavily armored Romans, who were trained for open-field combat, not chasing swift, lightly equipped guerrillas through familiar wilderness. The ultimate testament to the success of this resistance is not found in a history book, but in stone, stretching 73 miles from coast to coast across northern England. Hadrian's Wall, begun in the year 122 AD, is often misrepresented as the northern border of Roman Britain. In reality, it was never a border in the modern sense, but a sophisticated military barrier designed for control, not containment. It was a powerful symbol of limitation, a colossal admission by the world's greatest empire that some people simply could not be conquered. The wall was a multi-layered system of stone and turf, featuring forts manned by thousands of troops, watchtowers for signaling, and guarded gates that regulated movement and trade. It was not built to stop an invading army. The Picts were not trying to conquer the south. It was built to manage a persistent, low-level threat. It prevented small, fast-moving raiding parties from easily slipping into the wealthy Roman farmlands to the south to steal livestock or supplies, and it allowed the Romans to monitor movement and tax any trade that did occur. Its very existence is a monument to the persistent pressure applied by the northern tribes, a pressure so constant and costly that Rome's response was one of history's most expensive and elaborate defensive projects. This prolonged resistance had a profound and lasting cultural impact. While the Romans urbanized the south, building baths and introducing Latin, the peoples beyond the wall and in the western mountains were largely insulated from this cultural assimilation. In these regions, ancient Celtic languages, artistic traditions, and social structures continued to flourish untouched. The Picts, whose name comes from the Latin picti meaning painted people, developed a unique and sophisticated culture, leaving behind hundreds of beautifully carved symbol stones whose meanings still tantalize archaeologists. They maintained a complex matrilineal system of royal succession that baffled and frustrated their Roman and later Anglo-Saxon neighbors. Similarly, in Wales, the Brythonic language evolved into what we now know as Welsh, and the bardic traditions of storytelling and poetry preserved a vast oral history that celebrated heroes who defied foreign invaders. In Cornwall, a distinct Brythonic culture thrived, with its own language and identity that persists to this day. When the Roman legions were finally withdrawn from Britain in the early 5th century to deal with crises closer to home, it was these culturally intact regions that became the bedrock for the post-Roman world. The vacuum of power was not filled by a return to a generic British way of life, but by the re-emergence of these fiercely independent identities that had been preserved through centuries of resistance. The kingdoms of the Picts would eventually merge with the Gaelic Scots of Dal Rhiannon to form the foundation of Scotland. The Welsh princes, drawing on a deep well of cultural continuity, fought off Anglo-Saxon expansion for centuries, preserving their language and laws in a way that no other part of former Roman Britain did. The story of these communities is a powerful lesson in the long game of cultural survival. Their refusal to submit ensured that the story of Britain would never be a simple, singular narrative of Romanization, but rather a complex and enduring tapestry woven from many different threads of defiance and identity. While the formidable Picts and Celts used the misty highlands of Britain to defy Rome, another group of fierce indigenous warriors was employing a very different landscape to wage a similar struggle for independence: the vast, sun-scorched expanses of North Africa. Here, the Berber peoples, a collection of diverse tribes with a shared cultural heritage, stood as a persistent and formidable obstacle to Roman ambitions on the southern shores of the Mediterranean. The Romans knew this region as the provinces of Numidia and Mauritania, but for the Berbers it was simply home, a land they had inhabited for millennia, and one they were prepared to defend with every ounce of their being. Their story of resistance is not a single, unified narrative but a centuries-long saga of rebellion, adaptation, and an unbreakable connection to a harsh and beautiful land, proving that the spirit of independence can burn as fiercely under a desert sun as it does in a mountain mist. The Berbers' greatest strategic advantage was an intimate, generational knowledge of their environment. Where the Romans saw an empty, intimidating expanse, the Berber tribes saw a familiar and navigable world. They were masters of the desert and the rugged mountain ranges like the Atlas, using their incredible mobility to dictate the terms of every engagement. Mounted on agile local horses and later making brilliant use of the camel, an animal perfectly evolved for the Sahara, they could move vast distances with astonishing speed, appearing as if from nowhere to strike a vulnerable Roman outpost or supply convoy before vanishing back into the shimmering heat haze. This was not the kind of warfare the Roman legions were built for. Their famous discipline and heavy armor became liabilities in the face of an enemy that refused to stand and fight in a conventional line. The Berbers turned the desert itself into a weapon, luring overconfident Roman forces deep into arid territory where thirst, heatstroke, and disorientation would weaken them long before a blade was ever drawn. This relentless resistance produced some of the most charismatic and cunning leaders to ever challenge Rome's authority. One of the earliest and most famous was Jugurtha, the Numidian prince whose conflict with Rome from 112 to 105 BC escalated into a full-scale war known as the Jugurthine War. Jugurtha was a master of asymmetric warfare, he reportedly observed that Rome was a city for sale and doomed to perish if it finds a buyer, a cutting commentary on the corruption he saw in the Republic, which he then expertly exploited. He used bribery to buy temporary truces and employed guerrilla tactics to wear down the frustrated Roman armies sent against him. For years, he humiliated Rome, proving that a determined local leader with a deep understanding of the land and its people could tie up the resources of a superpower. It was only when the Romans sent their consummate general, Gaius Marius, who adopted and adapted to the very guerrilla strategies Jugurtha had mastered, that the Numidian king was finally betrayed, captured, and executed in Rome. A century later, another brilliant Berber commander emerged to carry the torch of defiance, Tacfarinas, a former auxiliary soldier in the Roman army himself. Tacfarinas possessed an invaluable insider's knowledge of Roman tactics, discipline, and organization. He used this knowledge to build a rebel force that was more than just a loose band of raiders. He structured his fighters with a Roman-like discipline, creating a formidable hybrid army that combined local mobility with military order. His rebellion, which lasted from 17 to 24 AD, stretched across the entire North African frontier, tying down multiple Roman legions and requiring the attention of several emperors from Tiberius onwards. Tacfarinas was so successful that he even attempted to negotiate a formal settlement for his troops, demanding land for them in recognition of their strength, an audacious move that showed he viewed himself not as a bandit, but as the leader of a sovereign nation worthy of treaty. His eventual defeat came only after a massive and concerted Roman effort, but his prolonged campaign remains a stunning example of how a local insurgency, led by a tactical genius, could challenge the might of an empire for years on end. In the end, Rome's victory over the Berber kingdoms was secured not through martial brilliance alone, but through a ruthless and pragmatic application of its classic strategy: divide and conquer. The Romans were keen observers of tribal politics, and they expertly exploited long-standing rivalries and jealousies between different Berber groups. They would offer favorable treaties, wealth, and recognition to one tribe in exchange for their help in subduing a neighboring rival. They played chieftain against chieftain, slowly eroding the possibility of a united Berber front that could have presented an insurmountable challenge. Simultaneously, they began to co-opt the very warriors who had fought them so fiercely. Recognizing the formidable martial qualities of the Berber cavalry, the Romans began to actively recruit them as auxiliary units within their own army. These skilled horsemen, once the scourge of the legions, now found themselves serving the empire from Britain to the Euphrates, their unique fighting styles and knowledge of desert warfare becoming a valuable asset to the very power they had once resisted. This complex relationship of resistance, co-option, and eventual integration meant the Berber legacy was never truly erased. While political independence was lost, their cultural and genetic imprint on North Africa remained profound and enduring. Their languages, collectively known as Tamazight, persisted despite centuries of Roman, Vandal, Byzantine, and Arab rule, and are still spoken by millions today. Their influence seeped into the very fabric of the Roman provinces, from local religious practices and art to agricultural techniques suited to the arid climate. The Berber story is perhaps one of the most powerful testaments to the enduring spirit of indigenous peoples. It shows that even when military victory is achieved by an empire, the cultural identity of a people rooted in their land can never be fully subdued, remaining a timeless echo of defiance that continues to shape a region long after the empires have turned to dust. From the sun-baked deserts of North Africa, we now travel to the rugged, forested heart of the Balkans, a land that forged some of the ancient world's most formidable and feared warriors, the Thracians. If the Berbers were masters of the open desert, the Thracians were the undisputed lords of close-quarters combat, a people whose entire culture was steeped in the arts of war and whose very name became synonymous with a terrifying, almost divine fury on the battlefield. Unlike the unified kingdoms we've discussed, Thrace was never a single, cohesive nation but a collection of powerful, often rival tribes united by a common language and an unparalleled martial spirit. Their homeland, stretching across what is now modern Bulgaria, northern Greece, and Turkey, was a world of dense forests and imposing mountains, a perfect landscape for breeding hardened, independent people who would bow to no one. To their neighbors, the Greeks and later the Romans, the Thracians were a fascinating paradox, both barbaric in their ferocity and yet deeply spiritual, possessing a culture rich with intricate goldwork, ecstatic religious rituals, and a belief in the immortality of the soul that made them fear no enemy, not even the legions of Rome. The heart of Thracian identity was their warrior ethos. From a young age, Thracian men were trained in the use of their most iconic weapon, the rhomphaea. This was not merely a sword, it was a brutal, slashing weapon with a long, slightly curved blade on a wooden handle, capable of shearing through shields, armor, and limbs with a single, devastating blow. The sight of a Thracian warband, often fighting with a wild, ecstatic frenzy they believed was a gift from their god Ares, was enough to make even the most disciplined Roman soldier hesitate. Their distinctive appearance only added to their fearsome reputation. They wore fox skin caps, brightly colored cloaks, and intricate armor, and they were often tattooed with complex patterns, a mark of both status and spiritual belief. This was not an undisciplined mob. It was a culture that perfected the art of individual combat, valuing personal glory and heroic deeds above all else. Their society even had a class of warrior elites who lived as mercenaries, hiring out their formidable skills to the highest bidder across the Mediterranean, further spreading their legendary reputation. This fierce independence made their eventual incorporation into the Roman Empire a long and bloody process. Rome's conquest of Thrace was a slow, piecemeal affair of alliances, betrayals, and brutal punitive campaigns that spanned over a century. The Thracians did not surrender their freedom easily or all at once. They fought a relentless series of bloody revolts against Roman authority, the most famous of which was led by a king named Spartacus. Yes, that's Spartacus. Though history remembers him as the leader of a slave revolt within Italy, it is crucial to remember his origins. Spartacus was a Thracian from the Mede tribe, and he had once fought as an auxiliary in the Roman army before being enslaved and forced to become a gladiator. His rebellion, which erupted in 73 BC and terrorized Italy for 2 years, was not merely a slave uprising. It was, in many ways, a Thracian war fought on Roman soil. His military genius, his ability to unite a ragged band of slaves and gladiators into a force that defeated multiple Roman legions, was a direct product of his Thracian heritage and training. The tactics he employed, swift, guerrilla-style attacks, the use of difficult terrain to his advantage, and the inspiring, fearless leadership he displayed, were all hallmarks of the Thracian way of war. His revolt, though ultimately crushed with horrific brutality, left an indelible scar on the Roman psyche, a permanent reminder of the explosive fury that could erupt from the peoples they had conquered. Yet, for all the fear they inspired, the Thracians also earned a profound sense of admiration from the Romans, leading to one of the most fascinating aspects of their relationship: cultural absorption. Just as Rome had done with the Berbers, they recognized the incredible military potential of the Thracian warrior. They began to systematically recruit them into the Roman army as auxiliary cavalry and infantry. These Thracian units, with their distinctive rhomphaea and armor, became a common and highly valued sight across the empire, serving from Britain to Syria. Their unique fighting style was so effective that it was adopted and standardized by the Romans themselves. The specialized gladiator class known as the Thrax or Thracian was equipped in the traditional Thracian style, complete with a small rectangular shield and a curved sword, and became a huge crowd favorite in the amphitheaters. Furthermore, Thracian spirituality, particularly their worship of the horseman god Hero, began to merge with Roman cults, influencing local religious practices throughout the Balkans. This was the complex dance of conquest and assimilation. Rome may have claimed the land, but Thracian culture, particularly its martial spirit, conquered a permanent place within the Roman military machine and imagination. Their story shows us that resistance is not always a binary outcome of victory or defeat, but can sometimes be a process of transformation, where the spirit of a conquered people endures by becoming an essential part of the empire's own strength and identity. Now let's shift our gaze to the vast, windswept sea of grass that was the Eurasian steppe, a world without borders where mobility was life and the horizon was the only limit. Here, the Sarmatians emerged as a formidable force, a confederation of nomadic tribes whose entire existence was shaped by and for the horse. Their world was one of constant motion, a culture built on the back of the saddle, and their relationship with Rome would be defined not by sieges of great cities, but by the thunder of hooves along the empire's most vulnerable frontier. The Sarmatians were the masters of the open plain, and their arrival on the edges of the Roman world introduced the legions to a style of warfare that was as alien as it was terrifyingly effective, forcing the world's greatest infantry power to completely rethink its approach to defense. The core of Sarmatian power was their cavalry, and at the heart of that cavalry was a technological and tactical innovation that would change the face of warfare in Europe, the cataphract. This was not a light skirmisher like many other nomadic horsemen. The Sarmatian cataphract was a force of sheer, overwhelming shock. Imagine a warrior and his steed both encased almost entirely in scale armor made from horn, leather, or even iron. This living battering ram, often called a clibinarius or oven man by the Romans due to the heat of the armor, was armed with the contos, a massive lance that required both hands to wield. The charge of a Sarmatian cataphract unit was a sight to inspire pure dread, a seemingly unstoppable wave of steel and muscle designed to shatter any infantry formation it encountered. This heavy cavalry dominance was complemented by lighter horse archers who could harry and weaken an enemy from a distance with clouds of arrows before the cataphracts delivered the final, crushing blow. This combined arms approach on horseback made them one of the most tactically sophisticated and dangerous forces on the steppe, perhaps the most fascinating and enduring aspect of Sarmatian culture. One that captured the Roman imagination and continues to intrigue us today was the role of women. According to ancient historians like Herodotus, Sarmatian society had strong matriarchal elements. Their legends spoke of a tribe descended from Amazons and Scythians, and the archaeological evidence stunningly supports this. Excavations of Sarmatian burial mounds or kurgans across modern Ukraine and Russia have repeatedly uncovered the graves of women buried with full warrior honors. These were not symbolic gestures. These women were interred with their weapons, bows, quivers of arrows, swords, and sometimes even wearing the same scale armor as the male cataphracts. Their bones often show the telltale signs of a life in the saddle and the marks of combat injuries. This evidence paints a vivid picture of a society where women could be full participants in war, protecting the tribe's herds and people while the men were away on campaign. For the Greeks and Romans, whose own women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, these warrior women were the stuff of legend, directly feeding into their myths of the Amazons, a powerful, independent race of female fighters. The Sarmatians showed them that such a people were not just myth, but a living reality on the distant steppes. The Roman Empire first encountered this formidable power along the Danube River frontier, a natural boundary that separated the ordered world of the empire from the chaotic freedom of the steppe. For centuries, this river was the tense dividing line between two utterly different ways of life. The Sarmatian tribes, particularly the Iazyges and the Roxolani, did not seek to conquer and settle Roman territory in a conventional sense. Their warfare was one of raid and extraction. They would launch lightning-fast raids across the river, striking deep into the provinces of Pannonia and Moesia to seize loot, livestock, and captives before melting back across the plains with their plunder. These were not random acts of banditry but highly organized military operations that exploited the Romans' greatest weakness. Their relatively slow-moving, infantry-based army was completely ill-equipped to chase down a highly mobile enemy that could cover vast distances in a short time. The psychological impact was immense. The constant threat of a sudden, devastating raid from an unpredictable direction created a state of perpetual anxiety along the entire frontier. This persistent pressure forced the Romans into a massive and expensive adaptation of their entire military doctrine. They had to become a cavalry power to meet the Sarmatian threat. The Romans began to recruit vast numbers of auxiliary cavalry from other nomadic peoples, and they increasingly relied on hired Sarmatian mercenaries themselves, a classic Roman strategy of fighting fire with fire. The iconic image of the Roman legionary began to share the stage with the armored horsemen. Furthermore, the entire defensive philosophy of the frontier shifted. While they continued to build forts and watchtowers, they also had to create vast intelligence networks to monitor the movements of the steppe tribes and maintain large, mobile cavalry reserves that could respond to incursions at a moment's notice. The Sarmatians, perhaps unwittingly, were responsible for pushing the Roman army toward the more cavalry-centric structure that would characterize the later empire. The decline of the Sarmatians as an independent power was a slow process driven by a combination of external pressure and internal change. From the east, they faced relentless waves of new nomadic migrations, most notably the Goths and later the Huns, who pushed against their territories and gradually displaced them. Simultaneously, the magnetic pull of the Roman Empire worked its gradual magic. As had happened with so many others, many Sarmatians were gradually absorbed into the Roman world. After major defeats, entire tribes were sometimes settled within the empire's borders as Leti federated allies granted land in exchange for military service. The most famous example of this Sarmatian legacy within the empire is the northern British city of Ribchester, where a 5,000-strong contingent of Sarmatian cavalry was stationed in the 2nd century AD. These warriors, so far from their ancestral steppes, became a permanent part of the island's defense, and some historians have even speculated that their legends and presence may have influenced the local Brythonic myths that centuries later evolved into the tales of King Arthur and his knights. The story of the Sarmatians ultimately reminds us that resistance and adaptation are a two-way street. They challenged Rome with a form of warfare it struggled to comprehend, forcing the empire to evolve, while their own destiny became forever intertwined with the civilization they once raided, leaving a lasting imprint on the military and cultural landscape of Europe. Yet for all their courage, tactical brilliance, and deep connection to their homelands, the defiant kingdoms we've explored ultimately could not hold out forever against the Roman juggernaut. Their stories are not of failure, but of a prolonged and heroic struggle against a set of overwhelming, systemic advantages that no single culture, no matter how resilient, could indefinitely overcome. The first and perhaps most decisive factor was Rome's breathtaking logistical and organizational machine. Think of it this way: while a kingdom like Dacia might call upon its entire population of fighting-age men for a climactic battle, Rome could lose an entire army in a foreign land and simply raise another one, drawing on a seemingly endless supply of manpower from across its vast territories. Their military-industrial complex was unmatched. Armories in Gaul mass-produced swords and armor. Quarries in Greece and North Africa provided stone for their fortifications, and a sophisticated network of roads and ports allowed them to supply legions stationed thousands of miles from Italy. This meant that Rome could sustain a war of attrition for decades, patiently grinding down an enemy through sheer, relentless pressure. A kingdom like that of the Caledonians or the Dacians, no matter how fierce, was ultimately fighting with the resources of a single region against the consolidated wealth and manpower of an entire continent. Every warrior lost was a devastating blow to them. For Rome, it was a temporary setback noted in a ledger to be rectified with the next draft of recruits. Beyond simple resources, Rome possessed a unique and ruthless capacity to learn and adapt from its opponents. This was an empire that turned every defeat into a lesson and every enemy innovation into a new part of its own arsenal. The classic example is their experience against the Carthaginian general Hannibal, whose tactical genius nearly destroyed them. They didn't just eventually defeat him. They studied his methods and incorporated elements of his maneuver warfare into their own doctrine. This pattern repeated itself for centuries. They learned guerrilla tactics from the Samnites in the Italian hills. They adopted the curved falques and modified their own armor after the bloody Dacian Wars, and they were forced to completely rethink their cavalry and frontier defense strategies after facing the hit-and-run raids of the Berbers and the thunderous charges of the Sarmatian cataphracts. This institutional adaptability meant that a tactic that worked brilliantly against a Roman army one year might be completely neutralized the next. The Roman military was a constantly evolving organism, and it would not make the same mistake twice. A resistant kingdom, by contrast, often relied on a core set of strategies honed over generations, their unique way of war. When Rome finally cracked that code, their greatest strength could become their most fatal vulnerability. Perhaps the most heartbreaking factor in the collapse of resistance was not the external force of the legions, but the internal fractures within the societies themselves. Rome was a master of the ancient art of divide and conquer, and they expertly exploited existing tribal rivalries, class tensions, and political jealousies. They would offer lavish rewards, titles, and promises of power to one chieftain or faction in exchange for betraying their people or turning on a rival. We see this time and again. In Numidia, the Romans used the internal conflict between Jugurtha and his rivals to justify their intervention and eventual conquest. In Britain, they leveraged the rivalry between different Celtic tribes to secure allies who would fight alongside them. Even in Judea, the tragic internal divisions between Jewish factions, the Zealots, the Sicarii, and the more moderate leaders severely weakened their defense during the Great Revolt, with different groups sometimes fighting each other inside Jerusalem, even as the Roman army built its siegeworks outside the walls. This strategy was devastatingly effective because it turned a people's greatest strength, their shared identity, against them, sowing distrust and paranoia at the very moment unity was most crucial. Finally, we cannot overlook the silent, impersonal forces that shaped these conflicts. Environmental change played a critical role in the decline of several holdouts. The Garamantes, for instance, built their entire civilization on the ingenious but unsustainable mining of fossil water. As their aquifers slowly drained and the climate of the Sahara became even more arid, their agricultural base shrank, weakening their society from within and making them more vulnerable to external pressure, even if that pressure never came in the form of a full-scale Roman invasion. Economic factors were equally powerful. The Nabataeans maintained their independence for as long as they controlled the lucrative incense trade routes. But when Rome developed new maritime routes or shifted its economic interests, the Nabataean kingdom lost its primary source of wealth and its strategic value as a useful buffer state, making its annexation by Trajan a simple administrative decision rather than a military necessity. And then there was the sheer physical impact of Roman engineering. The construction of Hadrian's wall didn't just keep the Picts out. It permanently severed ancient trade and cultural links between the tribes of northern and southern Britain, economically isolating the north and making long-term resistance more difficult. These vast infrastructure projects didn't just demonstrate Roman power, they actively reshaped the very landscape and economy of a region, creating a new reality that made continued defiance increasingly impractical. The fall of these last kingdoms was never a simple story of brave natives versus an evil empire. It was a complex tapestry woven from threads of overwhelming force, brilliant adaptation, tragic internal division, and the slow, inexorable pressures of a changing world, a sobering reminder that in history, the outcome is rarely determined by courage alone. While the image of the Roman legionaries' hobnailed boot crushing all resistance is a powerful one, it tells only half the story. For every kingdom subdued by sheer military might, another was gradually and deliberately woven into the fabric of the empire through a far more subtle and often more effective tool, the art of soft power. Rome's true genius lay not just in its ability to win wars, but in its unparalleled skill at winning the peace that followed, transforming former enemies into loyal subjects and even ardent defenders of the very system that had conquered them. This was not a simple process of erasure. It was a complex, calculated, and often mutually beneficial dance of diplomacy and assimilation, a strategy designed to make resistance not just futile, but ultimately undesirable for those who were being absorbed. At the heart of this strategy was a simple, powerful offer: join us and share in the rewards. For the elite classes of conquered societies, Rome presented an irresistible package of incentives. Local chieftains and kings who acquiesced to Roman authority were often confirmed in their positions, granted prestigious Roman titles, and showered with wealth. Their sons were frequently educated in Rome itself, immersed in Latin literature and Roman customs, returning home not as rebellious heirs to a lost throne, but as enthusiastic proponents of the imperial project, their loyalties now firmly tied to the metropolis. The ultimate prize was the grant of Roman citizenship, a legal status that conferred immense privilege, protection, and social mobility. This was a brilliant co-option of the existing power structure. Instead of creating a new ruling class from scratch and provoking resentment, Rome simply gave the old ruling class a compelling reason to buy into the new system. Why lead a desperate rebellion for a fading independence when you could become a respected Roman senator, a wealthy landowner, or a powerful official within the greatest empire on earth? This calculated generosity effectively turned the most likely leaders of resistance into the empire's most effective ambassadors and administrators. Beyond courting the elite, Rome worked to reshape the very fabric of daily life in the provinces, making Roman-ness synonymous with progress, comfort, and security. They didn't just build forts, they built cities, and with those cities came all the seductive trappings of Roman civilization. Aqueducts brought fresh water to thirsty populations. Public baths offered hygiene and socialization, and sprawling amphitheaters provided spectacular entertainment. Vast networks of safe, paved roads connected once isolated towns to vibrant new economic networks, allowing local goods to reach distant markets and bringing unprecedented wealth to cooperative regions. A uniform system of Roman law replaced often arbitrary local traditions, offering a predictable and theoretically impartial system of justice that appealed to the common person. This infrastructural revolution created a powerful, tangible argument for compliance. Life under the Roman peace, the Pax Romana, for those who accepted it, was often more stable, more prosperous, and more connected than life before. The message was clear: resistance meant clinging to a harder, poorer past, while assimilation offered a brighter, more comfortable future. Yet to view this process as a one-way street of cultural imperialism is to miss its profound complexity. While Rome was undoubtedly the dominant partner, it was also a voracious consumer of the cultures it encountered. This was not a polite exchange but a dynamic, often unconscious process of absorption that fundamentally enriched Roman civilization itself. The religions of conquered peoples did not simply vanish. Their gods were frequently identified with Roman equivalents and incorporated into the vast imperial pantheon. The Egyptian goddess Isis became a hugely popular figure in Rome itself, and the wild, ecstatic rites of the Greek god Dionysus were adopted, albeit with some nervous supervision by the state. In art and architecture, Greek styles remained the gold standard, while Celtic metalworking techniques influenced Roman craftsmanship. Even the imperial purple dye, a symbol of ultimate power, came from the murex snails harvested by Phoenician subjects. The most profound example might be in governance itself. The concept of a single, all-powerful emperor, a divine monarch, was far more in line with Eastern traditions like those of Egypt and Persia than with Rome's own republican past. The empire, in many ways, became a fusion of its constituent parts, a melting pot where the conqueror was forever being changed by the conquered. This delicate dance left a lasting legacy on both sides. For the subjugated peoples, the challenge became one of cultural preservation within the overwhelming tide of Romanization. Many communities became bilingual, using Latin for commerce and law while keeping their native tongue for the home and for ancient songs and stories. Local religious practices often persisted under a thin veneer of Roman interpretation, a phenomenon scholars call interpretatio Romana. In Britain, the Celtic horse goddess Epona was adopted by the Roman cavalry and worshipped across Europe, her original identity preserved even as she served a new master. This cultural endurance testifies to the incredible resilience of identity, showing that even without political independence, a people can safeguard the core of who they are through language, ritual, and memory, ensuring that their heritage is not erased but instead becomes a lasting thread in the rich tapestry of the empire's own, ever-evolving story. But how do we move beyond the grand narratives of emperors and armies to truly understand the lives of these resilient people? The answer lies not in dusty old scrolls alone, but in the very earth beneath our feet, where the tangible remnants of their world have waited centuries for us to find them. Modern archaeology acts as our greatest time machine, offering an invaluable, direct line to these lost kingdoms, cutting through the biases of Roman historians to reveal a story written in stone, bone, and artifact. Every trowel of dirt turned at a significant site is like turning a page in a history book they wrote themselves, providing undeniable evidence of their sophistication, their struggles, and their stunning adaptability. Take the incredible water management system of Petra, for instance. For centuries, the Nabataeans' genius was shrouded in legend, but meticulous excavation has uncovered the astonishing reality. a complex network of dams, cisterns, and terracotta pipes that channeled every precious drop of rainwater through the city. We can now walk through the narrow Sick Canyon and see the carved channels in the walls, touch the dams that diverted flash floods, and finally comprehend how they transformed a desert gorge into a thriving metropolis. This isn't just ancient engineering, it's a testament to a civilization that mastered its environment, and archaeology gives us the proof. The story becomes even more poignant at places like Samnites Regia, the sacred capital of the Dacians. High in the mountains of Romania, the ruins tell a tale of fierce defiance and brutal conquest. Excavations here reveal a sprawling complex of temples, residences, and formidable fortifications. We can see the distinct difference between the elegant, circular Dacian sanctuaries and the harsh, angular Roman military buildings constructed after its fall. Finding hordes of hidden weapons and tools hurriedly stashed away paints a vivid picture of the Dacians' final, desperate hours, trying to hide their treasures from the invading legions. Meanwhile, along the misty border of England and Scotland, Hadrian's Wall stands as archaeology on a monumental scale. It's not just a wall, it's an entire landscape of discovery. Excavations of the forts along its length, like Vindolanda, have yielded treasures that breathe life into the Roman military presence. The most famous are the Vindolanda tablets, thin slivers of wood on which soldiers wrote letters home in ink. These fragile documents preserve the most human moments: birthday party invitations, requests for socks to combat the bitter cold, and complaints about the local Britons. This is the other side of the resistance, the daily grind of the occupying force, and it's archaeology that delivers these intimate voices across 2 millennia. The tools of the archaeologist have undergone a revolution themselves, moving far beyond the brush and trowel to embrace technologies that feel like something from science fiction. Light detection and ranging, or LiDAR, is perhaps the most groundbreaking. This technology uses laser pulses shot from an aircraft to map the ground surface, digitally stripping away dense forest canopy to reveal hidden features below. It has been revolutionary in places like the jungles of Central America, but it's also transforming our understanding of resistant landscapes in the Roman world. In Scotland, LiDAR is helping to map the complex system of Iron Age hill forts and settlements that lay hidden for centuries in the difficult terrain, showing us that the Caledonian resistance was backed by a much more populated and organized society than previously believed. Similarly, isotope analysis is allowing us to trace the life stories of individuals. By analyzing the chemical signatures locked into teeth and bones, scientists can determine where a person grew up, what they ate, and even if they migrated long distances during their lifetime. Imagine analyzing the remains of a warrior buried near Hadrian's Wall and discovering he was actually from Eastern Europe, a Sarmatian cavalryman stationed there by Rome. This technology shatters simple ideas of us versus them, revealing the incredible movement of people across the empire and adding profound layers of complexity to our understanding of cultural contact and conflict. Each of these discoveries, from a massive carved wall to a single child's leather shoe, functions as a crucial piece in a vast, interconnected puzzle. They allow us to move beyond the simplistic labels of barbarian or rebel and appreciate these cultures on their own terms. Archaeology gives voice to the voiceless, recovering the stories of everyday farmers, artisans, and soldiers who lived and died under the shadow of an empire. It helps us understand not just how they were conquered, but how they lived, what they valued, and the ingenious ways they found to persevere. By physically uncovering their world, we build a bridge across the centuries, transforming myths and legends into a tangible, relatable human story of resistance, resilience, and the enduring will to remain free. Even after the last standard was captured and the final fortress fell, the story of these defiant kingdoms was far from over. Their political independence may have been extinguished, but a far more enduring form of resistance was just beginning. A quiet, stubborn preservation of identity that would seep through the centuries, weaving itself into the very fabric of the modern world. This is perhaps their greatest and most overlooked victory. Not that they held back the legions for a time, but that they ensured their spirit would never truly be vanquished. Their legacy lives on, not in history books alone, but in the living, breathing pulse of language, tradition, and national character. A silent testament to the idea that culture is the ultimate fortress, one that no empire can ever fully breach. Consider the fascinating linguistic tapestry of modern Romania. When the Romans conquered Dacia, they imposed Latin, the language of the administration and the legions. Over time, this evolved into Romanian, a Romance language surrounded by a sea of Slavic tongues. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers of the Dacians. Linguists have identified a core substrate of perhaps several hundred words in Romanian that have no Latin root and are believed to be a direct inheritance from the Dacian language. These aren't words for empire or conquest. They are the fundamental, earthy vocabulary of a people deeply connected to their land, words for plants like brad fir tree, animals like bruca wild sheep, and rural life. This suggests that while the Dacian elites may have been Romanized, the common people, the farmers and shepherds in the Carpathian valleys, held onto their ancient ways of describing the world around them, preserving a Dacian soul within a Latin shell. Their folklore, too, is filled with stories of powerful, ancient figures like the Zeme, a dragon-like creature, and the eel, mysterious fairy-like beings, which many scholars trace back to pre-Roman Dacian mythology, a timeless echo of a world that existed long before the eagles arrived. This cultural endurance is even more striking when we look at the Berber peoples of North Africa. Here, the resistance was not a single event but a continuous thread running through millennia of history, outlasting not only Rome but the Vandals, Byzantines, Arabs, and French. The Berber identity, expressed through the umbrella term Amazigh, which means free people, has survived against incredible odds. Their languages, collectively known as Tamazight, are still spoken by millions across Morocco, Algeria, and beyond. After years of suppression, the Amazigh movement has successfully fought for official recognition, and today, Tamazight is an official language in Morocco, even appearing on street signs and in television broadcasts. Their ancient Tifinagh script, once used in rock inscriptions across the Sahara, has been revived and standardized for modern use. Traditional Amazigh music, with its distinctive rhythms and instruments, continues to thrive, and their vibrant art, particularly the intricate designs of Berber carpets and tattoos, each symbol telling a story of identity, community, and protection, is celebrated worldwide. The Berbers exemplify how a culture can withstand wave after wave of foreign domination by rooting itself so deeply in the daily lives of its people that it becomes inseparable from the land itself. This phenomenon of cultural persistence challenges the very definition of victory and defeat. We often measure history by maps and dates of conquest, but these legacies ask us to consider a different metric. The Jewish people, after the catastrophic defeats of the Great Revolt and the Bar Kokhba Revolt, faced the destruction of their temple, the loss of their homeland, and a diaspora that scattered them across the globe. By any conventional military standard, their resistance had failed utterly, and yet it was in this seeming defeat that they forged a new, incredibly resilient form of cultural survival. Without a state or a central temple, they recentered their faith around the Torah, the rabbis, and the synagogue. They carried their laws, their language, and their traditions with them into every corner of the world, preserving them through centuries of persecution. Their calendar, their holidays like Passover, which retells a story of liberation, and their unbreakable connection to Jerusalem ensured that their national identity was not tied to a piece of land but to a shared story and a common faith. In a profound way, their resistance never ended. It simply changed form, becoming a 2,000-year project of cultural preservation that ultimately led to the modern rebirth of the State of Israel. Their story powerfully demonstrates that a people's spirit cannot be eradicated on the battlefield if it is fiercely guarded in the home, the school, and the place of worship. These enduring echoes are all around us if we know where to look. In Scotland, the image of the rugged, independent Highlander, so central to the national identity, is a direct descendant of the Caledonian tribes who defied Rome. The bagpipes, the tartan patterns of the clans, and the Gaelic language all serve as cultural bulwarks that have preserved a distinct Scottish identity despite centuries of political union with England. In Wales, the persistent and proud revival of the Welsh language, alongside the annual national Eisteddfod festival celebrating poetry and music, keeps alive the culture of the ancient Britons who refused to be fully absorbed by the Romans or the later Anglo-Saxons. Even in our weekdays, we unknowingly pay homage to a form of resistance. The names Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday come from the Germanic gods Tyr, Woden, Thor, and Frigg, whose worship was once a defining feature of the cultures that resisted Roman expansion along the Rhine. Rome may have conquered the land, but the names of the days remember the gods of those who fought back. This invisible continuity is the true triumph of the last kingdoms. It reminds us that history is not a simple story of conquerors and the conquered. The legacy of these resilient cultures is a testament to the human instinct to preserve, to remember, and to pass on. They teach us that while empires are built on force, identity is built on memory, and memory is far more durable than stone. The walls of Samnites Getusa Regia may lie in ruins, but the stories told in the villages below still carry its echo. The Garamantian Fogaras may have dried up, but the knowledge of how to survive in the desert was passed down through generations of Tuareg nomads. This is how these kingdoms truly live on, not as footnotes in a Roman history book, but as active, vibrant participants in our modern world, their ancient spirit forever woven into the languages we speak, the stories we tell, and the identities we hold dear. While the legions of Rome were an undeniable force, history teaches us that sometimes the most powerful enemy is not an army, but the very land beneath your feet. For many of the last kingdoms to resist Roman rule, their ultimate undoing may not have been a decisive battle lost, but a slow, creeping change in the world around them, a shift in the climate, a depletion of the soil, or the silent draining of a vital resource. This perspective invites us to consider a fascinating and sobering question. Could these resilient cultures, who held off the greatest military machine on Earth, have been ultimately brought low by environmental factors they could neither predict nor control? The story of the Garamantes in the Sahara offers a perfect and poignant case study. Their entire civilization was a masterpiece of adaptation, a network of lush oases sustained by an incredible feat of engineering the Fogara system. These underground tunnels tapped into ancient fossil water aquifers, water that had been sealed beneath the rock for millennia. It was a brilliant solution, but it had one critical flaw. It was mining a finite resource. The Garamantes weren't using water that was being replenished by annual rains. They were drawing from a prehistoric bank account with no new deposits. Over centuries, the water tables inevitably began to drop. Maintaining the long, fragile tunnels became a desperate and losing battle against collapsing shafts and silting channels. This internal decline was likely accelerated by a broader trend of desertification, a gradual drying of the Sahara that made their already harsh world even more unforgiving. Their agricultural surplus, the very foundation of their wealth and power, slowly shrank. By the time Roman pressure increased in later centuries, they were likely confronting a civilization already weakened from within, its resilience sapped not by swords, but by the silent, relentless retreat of the water that gave it life. The challenge of sustaining a population in a fragile environment was not unique to the desert. In other regions, particularly in the densely forested areas of Europe, kingdoms may have faced a different kind of resource exhaustion, the slow degradation of their land through deforestation and soil depletion. Imagine a powerful tribe in Germania or Britannia, its identity and security tied to a specific territory. As its population grew, either naturally or through the consolidation of power, the demand for resources would have skyrocketed. Trees would be felled for fortifications, for fuel, and to clear land for farming. Without sophisticated crop rotation or fertilization techniques, repeated farming on the same plots would have steadily drained the soil of its nutrients, leading to lower yields and poorer harvests. This creates a vicious cycle. A need for more land to feed the people leads to more deforestation, which can lead to soil erosion and further loss of fertile ground. A kingdom in this position becomes internally vulnerable. Its ability to sustain its warriors, to stockpile food for sieges, and to weather a bad growing season is severely compromised. When a Roman army arrives not with a single decisive blow, but to establish a permanent garrison and begin a war of attrition, this ecological weakness becomes a critical strategic liability. The kingdom isn't just fighting the legions camped outside its gates, it's fighting against the declining fertility of its own homeland, a battle that is much harder to win. We can also look to the broader picture of climate change during the Roman period. Paleoclimatologists, scientists who study ancient climates using evidence from ice cores, tree rings, and sediment layers, have identified periods of significant climatic shift that coincided with major historical events. The Roman warm period, a centuries-long era of relatively stable and warm conditions, certainly facilitated Rome's own agricultural prosperity and expansion. However, as this period began to wane, giving way to cooler and more unpredictable weather patterns, the edges of the empire and the independent lands beyond would have felt the effects most acutely. For a kingdom perched in the northern highlands or already living on the climatic edge, a shift toward colder temperatures could shorten growing seasons, reduce harvests, and make winters more deadly. Such changes wouldn't just cause hardship, they could trigger famine, force migrations, and spark internal conflicts over dwindling resources. A society grappling with these immense internal pressures is a society fractured and weakened, far less capable of mounting a unified and sustained defense against an external threat like Rome. The environmental stress doesn't need to deliver the final blow itself. It simply needs to create the conditions where that final blow becomes inevitable. This historical view forces a powerful and uncomfortable reflection on our own modern world. The struggles of the Garamantes with their water management echo the challenges faced by major cities today that are draining aquifers faster than they can be replenished. The concept of deforesting land and depleting soil to sustain a growing population is a story playing out in real time across the globe. And the looming specter of human-caused climate change, with its predictions of rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and shifting agricultural zones, mirrors the kind of large-scale environmental pressures that may have contributed to the collapse of ancient societies. The lesson here is not one of certain doom, but of critical vulnerability. These kingdoms demonstrate that a civilization's greatness is not just measured by its military might or cultural achievements, but by the sustainability of its relationship with the environment that supports it. Their stories remind us that the most profound threats we face may not always march under a foreign banner, but can instead emerge silently from the world we have taken for granted, challenging us to learn from the past and build a future that is not only powerful, but also enduringly resilient. Yet, even as environmental shifts posed one kind of challenge, another set of pressures was quietly eroding these kingdoms from within the complex and often invisible forces of economic and social change. A civilization can withstand a siege or adapt to a drier climate, but how does it defend itself against the slow strangulation of its economy or the bitter divisions tearing apart its own people? For many of the last holdouts, the real battle wasn't always lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the marketplace, in the treasuries, and in the fracturing trust between a people and their leaders. When Rome expanded its control over the Mediterranean world, it wasn't just conquering land. It was effectively building history's first great globalized economic network, and any independent kingdom on the outside of this system faced a terrible choice: try to compete and likely be crushed, or submit and be absorbed. The Nabataeans are the classic example of this economic dilemma. For centuries, their entire wealth and power were built on controlling the incredibly lucrative land routes for incense, spices, and luxury goods flowing from Arabia to the eager markets of Egypt, Greece, and Rome. They were the essential middlemen, the masters of the supply chain, and their magnificent city of Petra was a monument to this profitable role. But Rome, with its vast navy and relentless drive for efficiency, began to develop and secure alternative sea routes. Suddenly, the slow, expensive caravan journeys across the desert couldn't compete with the speed and volume of cargo ships sailing directly from the Red Sea to Roman ports. The Nabataeans' entire economic reason for being was undermined. Their unique value to Rome evaporated, and when Emperor Trajan annexed their kingdom in 106 AD, it was less a military conquest and more a corporate takeover, a logical, almost bureaucratic absorption of a business that had been rendered obsolete. Their independence wasn't stolen by the sword. It was made irrelevant by a shift in trade winds and Roman ledger books. Beyond the disruption of trade, many kingdoms faced the even more fundamental threat of resource exhaustion. Unlike the environmental changes we discussed earlier, this was often a problem of their own making, a success that contained the seeds of its own collapse. Consider the Dacians. Their fierce resistance against Rome was famously fueled by the immense gold and silver wealth mined from the mountains of Transylvania. This treasure paid for their formidable fortresses, armed their warriors, and bought alliances with neighboring tribes. But what happens when the easily accessible veins of ore begin to run out, or when the cost of digging deeper and deeper mines starts to outweigh the precious metal brought to the surface? A kingdom that bases its economy and its military power on a finite resource is building on a foundation that will eventually crumble. This creates a desperate paradox. You need to keep mining to fund the army that protects the mines, but the very act of extraction is depleting the source of your strength. This economic pressure can force reckless decisions, like launching risky raids on neighbors to seize new resources or overtaxing the peasant population to make up for the shortfall, actions that only breed more internal resentment and instability. The wealth that made them strong ultimately made them a target and then left them vulnerable when that wealth could no longer be sustained. A powerful lesson in the dangers of an economy that isn't diversified and renewable. Perhaps the most tragic factor in the disappearance of these kingdoms, however, was the internal social unraveling that often occurred under the immense stress of Roman pressure. It's a common historical pattern. When a powerful external threat emerges, a society can either unify in the face of a common enemy, or it can fracture along its existing fault lines, and all too often, it was the latter that occurred. Deep social stratification was a critical weakness. In many tribal societies, a powerful warrior aristocracy ruled over a large class of peasants, herders, and sometimes slaves. The elite had the most to lose from a Roman conquest: their power, their status, their land, and were therefore the most motivated to resist. But the common people, who bore the brunt of the fighting and the famine that often accompanied war, might have had a very different calculation. For them, Roman rule might initially promise an end to the constant warfare, a more predictable system of law, and access to new trade goods. This isn't to say they lacked patriotism, but rather that their daily reality was one of hardship, and Rome was masterful at exploiting this divide. They would offer favorable terms to local elites who switched sides, promising to preserve their status and wealth under the new administration. They would also present themselves as liberators to the lower classes, promising peace and order. This strategy of divide and conquer was devastatingly effective because it turned a nation's people against each other. We see hints of this in the tragic story of the Jewish Revolt, where bitter infighting between different Jewish factions, the Zealots, the Sicarii, and the more moderate priests, severely weakened Jerusalem's defenses from within, even as the Roman army built its siegeworks outside the walls. A house divided against itself cannot stand, and Rome was an expert at prying open those divisions. This combination of economic suffocation and social decay created a perfect storm that made long-term resistance nearly impossible. A kingdom struggling to compete economically cannot generate the surplus needed to pay and equip a standing army. A society riven by class resentment or leadership disputes cannot muster the unified will to make the immense sacrifices required for a prolonged war of independence. The story of these last kingdoms teaches us that resilience is not just a measure of military might or courage. True, enduring resilience is built on a foundation of economic sustainability and social cohesion. It requires an economy that can adapt to changing circumstances and is not dependent on a single, exhaustible resource. Even more importantly, it requires a sense of shared purpose and a measure of fairness that binds all levels of society together, from the highest chieftain to the lowest farmer. Without that internal strength, even the most formidable fortress will eventually fall, not because its walls were breached, but because the will to defend them from within simply crumbled away. But perhaps the most insidious and effective weapon in Rome's arsenal wasn't carried by a legionary, it was built by an engineer. Beyond the spears and the siege engines, Rome wielded a tool of conquest far more subtle and permanent: the power of infrastructure. The relentless march of the empire was followed by the even more enduring march of cobblestone roads, soaring aqueducts, and imposing fortifications. This was not merely construction, it was a calculated strategy of control written in stone and mortar, a physical system designed to first pacify and then permanently transform the very lands it conquered. For the defiant kingdoms that had resisted assimilation, these projects presented a devil's bargain. Accept the undeniable short-term benefits of Roman engineering, and in doing so, slowly but surely surrender the unique cultural and political identity you had fought so hard to protect. The initial appeal of these grand projects was undeniable and often strategically offered to win over a reluctant population. Imagine a highland chieftain in Britannia whose people have endured years of guerrilla warfare. A Roman legate arrives not with a new threat but with a proposal. Allow us to build a road through your territory, and we will pay your people to work on it. This road, he argues, will not just move our troops faster. It will connect your remote village to a vast network of trade. Your artisans can now sell their wares in distant markets. Your farmers can transport their surplus to towns that will pay good coin for it, and you will have access to goods and luxuries from across the known world. The same could be said for an aqueduct bringing a reliable, clean water supply to a settlement accustomed to seasonal droughts, or the security offered by a solid stone fort that deters raiders from rival tribes. In the short term, these were not acts of oppression but incredible investments in local quality of life and economic opportunity. Rome was essentially building a powerful, tangible argument for its own rule, demonstrating that life under the Pax Romana could be more prosperous, secure, and connected than the hardscrabble existence of perpetual independence. Yet woven into the fabric of every benefit was a strand of control. Those magnificent, arrow-straight roads that facilitated trade were, first and foremost, military highways. They allowed legions to move at unprecedented speed up to 25 miles a day, to crush any hint of rebellion before it could spread. A local uprising that might have taken weeks to respond to could now be met by fresh, heavily armed troops in a matter of days, utterly negating the defensive advantage of distance and difficult terrain that so many kingdoms had relied upon. The roads also created a system of efficient taxation and administration. Roman officials could now travel easily to conduct censuses, assess land values, and collect taxes with a new level of thoroughness that was impossible to evade. The infrastructure didn't just improve the economy, it placed it under the meticulous, watchful eye of the state, ensuring that the wealth generated by this new connectivity flowed directly into Roman coffers. The most profound impact, however, was cultural and psychological. The sheer, awe-inspiring scale of Roman engineering served as a constant, daily reminder of the empire's overwhelming power and permanence. A local tribesman might look at a massive, multi-tiered aqueduct marching across the valley and feel a sense of profound inferiority. His people built with wood and thatch, these Romans moved mountains and commanded rivers. This visible demonstration of technological superiority had a corrosive effect on local identity and pride. Furthermore, the very act of building these projects reshaped the social and physical landscape. To construct a legionary fortress required vast amounts of local timber and stone, often leading to deforestation that altered the environment. The camps and supply depots attracted traders, settlers, and camp followers, gradually growing into new towns vici that huddled around the Roman military presence. These towns operated in Latin, used Roman currency, and adopted Roman customs, creating pockets of alien culture within the heart of the Old Kingdom. The population slowly became dependent on the economy the Romans brought with them. A blacksmith who once made weapons for the local chieftain now finds more reliable work mending armor for the legion. A farmer shifts from growing traditional crops to supplying grain for the garrison. Over a generation or two, the very skills and traditions that defined the independent culture begin to atrophy, replaced by the practical needs of servicing the Roman machine. Nowhere is this dual nature of infrastructure as both barrier and bridge more perfectly encapsulated than in Hadrian's Wall. On its surface, it was the ultimate symbol of separation, a stark stone line dividing the Roman world from the barbarian unknown. But to see it only as a barrier is to miss its true, complex function. The wall was not a sealed border, it was a controlled interface. It had guarded gates where regulated trade occurred. The tribes to the north weren't completely shut out. They were forced to engage with the Roman system on Roman terms. They could bring their goods to these gates, but they would now be taxed. They could seek employment, but it would be as laborers for the Roman army. The wall created a new, artificial economic zone around itself, drawing the northern peoples into a dependent relationship. Their leaders might even be invited to conferences on the Roman side of the wall, wined and dined in the commanding officers' quarters, and given expensive gifts, a powerful form of diplomacy that co-opted the elite by making them stakeholders in the very system that contained them. The wall didn't just keep people out, it managed them, it transformed them, and it slowly eroded the old patterns of life, replacing them with a new reality where crossing the wall to trade with the Romans became more economically vital than maintaining old alliances across the northern hills. In the end, the most lasting conquest was not achieved by the sword, but by the trowel, the surveying tool, and the aqueduct's arch, a silent, stone revolution that reshaped the world one road, one wall, and one water channel at a time. What makes the stories of these defiant kingdoms so compelling is not just their dramatic ends, but the incredible ingenuity they displayed in their struggle to survive. They offer us a masterclass in resilience, a term we hear often today but rarely see demonstrated with such creativity and sheer force of will. Their resistance took countless forms, proving there is no single blueprint for endurance. The Caledonians and the Thracians show us the power of tactical adaptation, turning their greatest weakness, rugged, difficult terrain, into their most formidable defensive weapon. They refused to fight Rome on its own terms, understanding that a direct confrontation was suicide. Instead, they mastered the art of the ambush, the swift raid, and the strategic retreat, using the land itself to negate the legion's advantages in discipline and numbers. This is a lesson in leveraging your unique strengths, even when they seem like disadvantages to an outside observer. Other kingdoms, like the Nabataeans and the Armenians, teach us the subtle art of strategic diplomacy and economic resilience. Their power wasn't rooted solely in military might, but in making themselves indispensable. The Nabataeans controlled a critical economic resource, the trade routes, and skillfully navigated the politics of powerful neighbors, buying themselves centuries of autonomy. Armenia, perpetually caught between Rome and Parthia, became a virtuoso of balance, playing the two superpowers against each other to maintain a fragile sovereignty. Theirs is a lesson in the power of leverage and strategic positioning, showing that sometimes the most effective resistance is not a shouted no, but a cleverly negotiated yes, but on my terms. Then there are the profound examples of cultural resilience, perhaps the most powerful form of resistance of all. The Jewish people, after the catastrophic loss of their temple and their homeland, faced what seemed like certain cultural extinction. Their response was one of the most stunning adaptations in human history. They recentered their entire faith from temple sacrifice to textual study, from a geographical center to a portable identity built around the Torah and the synagogue. This ensured their survival as a distinct people for 2,000 years without a state. Similarly, the Dacians, though politically and militarily vanquished, left an indelible mark on the language and folklore of their land, their spirit surviving in the words and stories of their descendants. These ancient struggles resonate with startling urgency in our modern world, which faces its own set of overwhelming, globalized pressures. The Garamante story is a dire warning about environmental sustainability. Their brilliant irrigation system was also their fatal flaw, as it relied on consuming a finite resource. This mirrors our own contemporary challenges with groundwater depletion, deforestation, and climate change. Their civilization reminds us that no matter how advanced our technology, we must build our societies on a foundation of renewable balance with our environment, or face collapse from within. The economic pressures that undid the Nabataeans feel familiar in an age of globalization and shifting trade routes. Their independence became obsolete when Rome changed the economic rules of the game. Today, communities whose livelihoods are tied to a single industry can find themselves similarly vulnerable to global market shifts, automation, or remote policy decisions made in faraway capitals. The lesson here is the critical need for economic diversification and local resilience, ensuring that a community's survival isn't tied to a single, fragile thread. Perhaps the most timeless lesson is the one taught by the internal divisions that weakened so many of these kingdoms. Rome's masterful strategy of divide and conquer exploited existing social fractures, turning brother against brother. In our own era of intense political polarization and social fragmentation, this ancient tactic serves as a crucial warning. A society divided by internal strife, whether by class, ideology, or ethnicity, is inherently vulnerable to external manipulation and internal decay. The greatest defense a community can have is not a wall or a weapon, but a strong, cohesive social fabric built on trust, shared purpose, and a sense of common destiny. The stories of these last kingdoms ultimately teach us that resilience is not a passive quality of stubbornness, but an active, creative process of continuous adaptation. It is about knowing when to stand and fight, when to negotiate, when to innovate, and when to simply outlast. It is about preserving the core of your identity while being flexible in your methods. Their legacies, etched in ruins and whispered in languages that still survive, urge us to look beyond short-term victories and build for the long term, creating communities that are not only strong, but also sustainable, cohesive, and adaptable enough to withstand whatever the future may bring. It's incredibly tempting to view these defiant kingdoms through a romantic lens, to see them as perfect, noble underdogs fighting a purely evil empire. We often cast them as the ultimate freedom fighters, pristine cultures tragically crushed by the soulless Roman war machine. But this popular image, while stirring, is a dramatic oversimplification that does a real disservice to the rich, complicated truth. History is never a simple story of good versus evil. It's a messy, human tapestry woven with ambition, contradiction, and moral ambiguity. To truly honor these cultures, we must move beyond the myth of the noble savage and embrace their full, flawed humanity, recognizing that a society can be both courageously defiant and deeply complex in its own right. Take, for instance, the powerful and pervasive myth of universal virtue. The idea that every one of these resistant kingdoms was a bastion of egalitarian freedom is quickly dismantled by the historical record. Many of these societies practiced forms of slavery and engaged in their own brutal campaigns of expansion long before Rome ever appeared on their horizon. The fierce Thracians, celebrated for their warrior spirit, were also notorious slave traders, and their raids on neighboring Greek settlements were a primary source of captives for the Mediterranean market. The mighty Dacians, under rulers like Burebista, did not simply defend their mountain homeland. They embarked on their own imperial projects, conquering and subjugating neighboring tribes from the Black Sea to the Middle Danube. They were an empire in their own right, not just a collection of freedom-loving villagers. Even the Caledonians, so often portrayed as simple highlanders protecting their way of life, were likely a confederation of tribes with their own internal rivalries and hierarchies, where power was maintained by strong chieftains over lesser clans. Recognizing this doesn't diminish their resistance, it contextualizes it. They weren't pacifists defending a utopia. They were proud, powerful, and often aggressive cultures fighting to preserve their own sovereignty and their own systems of power, which included practices we would find deeply unjust today. This is where modern archaeology becomes our most valuable myth buster. cutting through centuries of romantic literature and nationalistic storytelling to provide tangible, undeniable evidence. The ruins of a society don't lie about its character. Excavations at Dacian fortresses like Samnites, reveal a society of stunning sophistication, with precise astronomical alignments in their sacred sanctuaries that rival Roman engineering. But those same digs also uncover evidence of a highly stratified society, with vast differences in wealth between the elite, who lived in sturdy stone buildings and owned fine imported Roman goods, and the common people in their simpler dwellings. In Britain, analysis of skeletal remains from the era reveals signs of intertribal violence that predate the Roman arrival, suggesting that the barbarian world was not a peaceful idyll, but a place of its own enduring conflicts. Perhaps most strikingly, the discovery of chains and shackles in pre-Roman settlements across Europe offers silent, grim testimony to the widespread practice of slavery, reminding us that the longing for freedom was often a privilege reserved for one's own people, not a universal right they championed for all. By stripping away these simplifying myths, we don't lessen these cultures, we actually make their stories more profound and more relatable. Understanding that the Dacians were a complex kingdom with slaves, elite nobles, and imperial ambitions makes their final, desperate stand against Trajan's legions not less tragic, but more so. It was not a simple paradise being destroyed. It was a real, multifaceted civilization with all its achievements and flaws, its art, its religion, its injustices being systematically dismantled. This nuanced view allows us to appreciate these cultures as they truly were, fully human. They were capable of creating breathtaking art and brutal warfare, of deep spiritual belief and ruthless political calculation. They could be generous to their allies and merciless to their enemies. This complexity is what makes history so fascinating. It frees these peoples from the flat roles of hero or victim and allows them to emerge as dynamic, real actors on the historical stage, making choices within the context of their own time and their own values. Their fight against Rome becomes even more significant when we understand what was truly at stake. Not just an idealized freedom, but their entire way of life, the good, the bad, and everything in between. Yet the Roman experience was far from unique in the grand, repeating theater of history. To truly understand the defiance of the Caledonians or the Dacians, we must widen our lens and place their struggles alongside those who stood against other great empires. This comparative view reveals a powerful truth that the clash between expanding power and resilient identity is a fundamental pattern, a deep and recurring rhythm in the story of human civilization. Each empire, from the Persians to the Mongols to the Ottomans, eventually reached its own geographic and cultural limits, meeting peoples whose connection to their land and way of life proved just as unbreakable as any Roman legion. Consider the mighty Persian Empire, a contemporary and fierce rival of ancient Rome that stretched from the Indus River to the Nile. Its Achaemenid rulers, much like the Roman emperors, faced persistent resistance on the fringes of their vast domain. In the mountainous wilds of what is now Afghanistan, the fierce tribes of Sogdia and Bactria refused to yield completely to Persian authority. Their resistance wasn't one of large-scale battles, but of constant, grinding rebellion, forcing the Persians to maintain expensive forts and garrisons in a region that never fully accepted their rule. This echoes the Roman experience in Caledonia or Germania, where the cost of occupation often outweighed the benefit, leading to a tense, fortified stalemate. The Persian approach also shared Rome's tactic of co-opting local elites, offering them positions within the imperial administration in exchange for loyalty, a strategy of assimilation that worked in some places but failed utterly in others, proving that the will to resist could not always be bought. Centuries later, the Mongol Empire exploded across Asia with a speed and ferocity that made even Rome's expansion seem gradual. Created by Genghis Khan, it became the largest contiguous land empire in history. Yet even the unstoppable Mongol horsemen met their match in places that defied their conventional warfare. A prime example is the mountainous kingdom of Georgia in the Caucasus. Though eventually forced to pay tribute, the Georgians used their formidable terrain, deep gorges and high fortresses, to wage a brilliant defensive campaign that inflicted heavy casualties on the Mongols and preserved a significant degree of autonomy. This is a direct parallel to the Dacians in their Carpathian strongholds or the Jewish rebels in the Judean hills, proving that geography could be the great equalizer against even the most powerful army. The Mongols, like the Romans, also discovered that while they could conquer territory, imposing their culture and identity was a far more difficult task. Many subjected peoples, from the Rus principalities to the Chinese, maintained their languages, religions, and social structures beneath the Mongol yoke, waiting for the moment the empire's grip weakened to reassert their own sovereignty. The Ottoman Empire provides another fascinating point of comparison, especially in its long, drawn-out struggle to absorb the mountainous regions of the Balkans. For centuries, the Ottomans ruled over a diverse array of peoples, but in the remote highlands of Montenegro and Albania, they never established full control. The Montenegrin tribes, much like the Scottish Highlanders, lived in a landscape of steep cliffs and narrow passes that made large-scale military campaigns nearly impossible. They preserved a fierce warrior culture and a form of self-governance that constantly defied Ottoman authority, engaging in a perpetual low-level conflict of raids and skirmishes. This sustained resistance over hundreds of years mirrors the persistent pressure the Picts applied to Roman Britain, a pressure so constant that it forced the construction of a massive, static defensive barrier like Hadrian's Wall. The Ottoman experience shows that resistance is not always about winning decisive victories, but about enduring, about making the cost of subjugation so high that an empire eventually decides you are not worth the trouble. We can even find powerful echoes of these ancient struggles in more modern contexts. The centuries-long resistance of the Scottish clans against English domination is a story steeped in the same themes of cultural preservation and tactical innovation. The use of the rugged highland terrain, the iconic guerrilla tactics, and the fierce clan loyalties that bound the society together are all deeply reminiscent of the Caledonian struggle against Rome. Similarly, the long and tragic history of Native American resistance against European colonization in North America represents one of history's most profound examples of this enduring dynamic. Diverse nations like the Apache, the Lakota, and the Iroquois Confederacy employed brilliant adaptive strategies, from the Comanches' mastery of the horse to the Seminoles' use of the Florida swamps, to resist an overwhelming technological and numerical advantage for as long as possible. Their fight, like that of the Dacians or the Jews, was for the very survival of a worldview, a spiritual connection to the land, and a distinct cultural identity in the face of an expansionist power that sought to erase it. These comparisons across time and space reveal that the dynamics of empire and resistance are universal, but the outcomes are infinitely shaped by specific context. What makes the Roman story unique is not the fact of resistance itself, but the particular combination of its highly organized, infrastructural method of conquest and the specific cultures it encountered. The Roman legacy of roads, laws, and urban planning created a different kind of imperial footprint than the horse-based dominance of the Mongols or the religiously structured rule of the Ottomans. And the cultures that resisted Rome with their druids, their mountain gods, and their intricate social structures brought their own unique spirit to the fight. By placing their stories next to others, we see that the desire for self-determination is a constant force in history, and that the most enduring victories are often not measured in battles won, but in the stubborn, unbreakable persistence of a people's identity long after the empires have faded into memory. Yet for all the advantages of terrain and cultural unity, the single most potent weapon in the arsenal of any resistant kingdom was often the force of a single, extraordinary personality. A charismatic leader could transform a scattered collection of tribes into a unified nation, could turn a defensive struggle into a bold campaign for glory, and could inspire ordinary people to achieve the extraordinary. These figures were more than just generals or kings. They became living symbols of their people's cause, their very names evolving into legends that would outlast their kingdoms and even the empire they dared to challenge. Think of Decebalus, the brilliant and cunning Dacian king whose very name meant the brave one. He was far more than a warrior. He was a strategic mastermind who understood that to defeat Rome, he needed to fight like Rome. He reorganized his army with Roman-style discipline, fortified the mountain passes with sophisticated citadels, and used his nation's vast gold reserves to fund a prolonged war and buy alliances with neighboring tribes. His personal magnetism held the Dacian Federation together, and his defiance was so potent that it required the full might of Emperor Trajan and a significant portion of the entire Roman military to finally crush him. His story, and that of others like him, shows us how one person's vision and courage can rally a people to seemingly impossible heights. But the stage for these defiant leaders wasn't confined to the misty forests of Dacia. In the sun-bleached sands of the Syrian desert, another figure emerged who would defy Rome with equal audacity: Queen Zenobia of Palmyra. Following the capture of her husband, King Odenathus, she took control of the wealthy trading city and embarked on a breathtaking campaign of expansion that briefly carved out a massive Eastern empire rivaling Rome itself. She presented herself not as a mere regional rebel, but as the direct heir to the legacy of Cleopatra and the Hellenistic empires, a cultured monarch who patronized philosophers and theologians while leading her armies from horseback. Her conquest of Egypt was a stunning blow to Roman prestige and a masterstroke that threatened Rome's vital grain supply. Zenobia's leadership was a potent blend of military prowess, political savvy, and brilliant propaganda, proving that the force of a charismatic personality could challenge an empire on political and cultural grounds, not just martial ones. Her legend, like that of Decebalus, transcends her ultimate defeat, cementing her place as an icon of ambition and independence. However, this very reliance on a singular, towering figure also contained the seeds of potential disaster. A resistance movement built around the cult of a personality is inherently fragile, its fate often inextricably linked to the life of its leader. The capture or death of that central figure could instantly evaporate the morale and cohesion of the entire movement, leading to a sudden and total collapse. The Dacian resistance effectively died with Decebalus on that rocky hillside. Similarly, the capture of the Jewish rebel Simon Bar Kokhba shattered the final revolt against Rome, and the defeat and capture of the British Queen Boudica led to the immediate dissolution of her massive coalition army. This vulnerability highlights a critical strategic weakness. While a powerful leader can unify and inspire, they can also become a single point of failure. The Roman military machine, by contrast, was designed to be impersonal and systematic. A legion could lose its commanding legate and continue to fight effectively under the next senior officer because it operated on doctrine and discipline, not the force of one man's will. This structural resilience gave Rome a significant advantage over kingdoms whose strength was so deeply invested in the life of their king. This paradox forces us to consider a deeper question about the nature of leadership itself within these struggles. Were these charismatic figures the sole architects of resistance, or were they the products of a people and a moment already ripe for defiance? It is likely a combination of both. A leader like Jugurtha in Numidia or Tacfarinas in North Africa could not have sustained their long campaigns without a deep well of popular discontent and a warrior culture ready to answer their call. The leader gives the resistance a face, a voice, and a direction, but the movement itself is fueled by the collective yearning of a people for freedom. The most successful leaders were those who could effectively channel that widespread desire into a coherent strategy, giving structure to the anger and hope of their followers. Yet their legacy is a double-edged sword. They leave behind a powerful national myth that can inspire future generations, but they also risk creating a model that is impossible to replicate, leaving a void that no subsequent leader can fill. The stories of these charismatic rulers remind us that history is often shaped by the compelling intersection of a singular individual and the powerful currents of their time, a combination that can alter the course of empires but whose flame can sometimes burn too brightly to last. Yet the fall of a kingdom is never the end of its people's story. The moment the last standard was captured or the final fortress fell, a new and often more complex chapter began, a sprawling human drama of adaptation, survival, and unexpected reinvention. For the men, women, and children who suddenly found themselves on the losing side of history, the world didn't simply end. It transformed into something entirely new and fraught with both peril and possibility. Their fates diverged dramatically, weaving a complex tapestry of outcomes that reveals the incredible resilience of human culture, even in the face of overwhelming force. Some communities were swallowed whole by the Roman machine, undergoing a process of assimilation that could feel both coercive and inviting. For the elite, this often meant a pragmatic calculation, exchanging political autonomy for personal power and privilege within the Roman system. A Dacian chieftain might find his son educated in Rome, returning not as a rebel leader but as a Roman citizen with a taste for wine and a position in the local administration. His family might retain their lands, but now they would be paying taxes to a distant emperor and speaking Latin in the forum. For the common people, assimilation was often a slower, more organic process, driven by the undeniable benefits of Roman peace. The arrival of a paved road could connect a remote village to bustling new markets, while the security offered by a nearby legionary fort meant fewer raids from rival tribes. Over generations, the old language might fade from public use. Local gods might be fused with Roman equivalents in a process scholars call interpretatio Romana, and the distinct cultural markers that once defined a people could gradually soften into a provincial Roman identity. This was not always a tragic erasure. For many, it was a practical adaptation to a new reality that offered stability, economic opportunity, and connection to a wider world. Other groups chose a different path, one defined by movement rather than integration. Faced with the prospect of subjugation, entire communities sometimes picked up and migrated, carrying their traditions with them to new lands beyond the reach of the eagles. This was not an organized retreat but a desperate, often chaotic displacement that could scatter a people across the map. We see evidence of this in the archaeological record of Northern Europe, where the pressure of Roman expansion seems to have triggered chain reactions of migration as tribes pushed against their neighbors, who in turn pushed against theirs. These movements could have dramatic and unintended consequences centuries later, reshaping the demographic and political landscape of the continent in ways the Romans themselves could never have predicted. The most profound example of this strategy, however, is undoubtedly the Jewish diaspora. Following the catastrophic failure of the revolts in Judea, the Jewish people faced an existential crisis. With their temple destroyed and their homeland incorporated into the Roman province of Syria Palestina, they were scattered across the empire and beyond. This forced exile or diaspora could have been the final blow to their identity. Instead, they performed one of history's most stunning acts of cultural preservation. Without a geographic center, they recentered their faith on the Torah and the synagogue. Rabbis became the new community leaders, and a vast tradition of textual commentary and oral law evolved to adapt their practices to a life in foreign lands. Their identity became portable, rooted not in soil but in shared law, shared stories, and a shared hope of return. In this case, the loss of a political kingdom led to the strengthening of a spiritual and cultural nation that would endure for 2 millennia. Then there were those who neither fully assimilated nor fled, but instead persisted in a kind of diminished, tenacious form within the shadow of the empire. These were the peoples who maintained a stubborn cultural resistance long after their political independence had been extinguished. In the highlands of Scotland, Wales, and Cornwall, the Celtic tribes never fully embraced Romanitas. They might have traded with the Romans, even served as auxiliaries in their army, but they retreated to their remote villages and held fast to their languages, their art styles, and their social structures. The Roman influence in these regions was often a thin veneer over a much older, resilient culture. After the legions were withdrawn from Britain in the early 5th century, it was from these culturally intact areas that a post-Roman world began to re-emerge. The Welsh language, directly descended from the Brythonic tongue spoken by the pre-Roman inhabitants, experienced a flourishing of literature and poetry that celebrated a heroic past of resistance. Similarly, the Picts in the north continued their distinct cultural development, leaving behind their magnificent symbol stones whose meanings still intrigue us today. Their persistence ensured that the story of Britain would never be a simple narrative of Romanization followed by Anglo-Saxon conquest, but rather a complex mosaic where ancient identities survived, adapted, and eventually reasserted themselves. The aftermath of resistance, therefore, is a story of transformation, not termination. It helps us see these conflicts not as clean in points but as profound transitions that set in motion new social, cultural, and even genetic currents that would flow for centuries. The large-scale colonization programs Rome implemented, like the one in Dacia where settlers were brought from across the empire to repopulate the mined-out region, created entirely new hybrid populations. The modern Romanian language, a Romance tongue born from Vulgar Latin, stands as a living testament to this process, yet it contains a substrate of Dacian words, often related to nature and rural life, proving that the conquered people left an indelible mark on the language of the conquerors. These long-term consequences ripple right into the modern era, influencing the borders, ethnic compositions, and national identities of contemporary nation-states. The enduring cultural divide between the Romance-speaking and Slavic-speaking parts of Europe, for instance, has its roots in the different ways regions were incorporated into the Roman Empire and later influenced by migrations. The story of what happened after the fall ultimately teaches us that while empires can win wars and redraw maps, the human spirit possesses a remarkable capacity for endurance, finding ways to preserve, adapt, and ultimately ensure that even in defeat, a people's legacy is never truly erased. Reflecting on the epic stories of these last kingdoms, we are left not with a simple tale of conquerors and the conquered, but with a far richer and more human tapestry woven from threads of incredible courage, breathtaking ingenuity, and a resilience that echoes across the centuries. Their struggles against the overwhelming force of Rome reveal something fundamental about the human spirit, a universal, unyielding desire for autonomy, for the right to shape one's own destiny and preserve a unique way of life. These were not just political conflicts, they were profound clashes of worldviews where the rigid, ordered logic of an empire met the fierce, organic spirit of diverse cultures determined to remain free on their own terms. The outcomes were shaped by a dizzying array of factors, not just the spear and the sword, but also the slow drain of an aquifer, the shifting winds of trade, the bitter divisions within a society, and the awe-inspiring power of a single leader's charisma. This complexity reminds us that history is never predetermined. It is a fluid story where environmental pressures, economic realities, and individual choices intertwine to create moments of breathtaking defiance and poignant change. As we navigate our own modern world, filled with its own forms of overwhelming pressures and globalized systems, the legacies of these ancient holdouts offer us powerful and timely lessons. Their stories are a masterclass in adaptation, showing us that resilience is not about stubbornly refusing to change, but about creatively finding ways to preserve what matters most. The Jewish people taught us how to carry an identity in the heart and the mind when it can no longer be rooted in the soil. The Berbers demonstrate how language and custom can become unbreakable fortresses of culture. The Dacians remind us that even in political defeat, a spirit can endure in the very words used to describe a homeland. These narratives urge us to value and protect cultural diversity, not as a quaint relic of the past, but as an essential wellspring of human creativity and perspective. They encourage us to look beyond simplistic headlines and understand the deep, underlying currents, be they environmental, economic, or social, that shape the conflicts and challenges of our time. Most importantly, they inspire us to strive for a world where different voices are not just tolerated, but truly heard and respected, where the power of a global community is balanced by the right of local cultures to thrive. Thank you for joining us on this profound journey into history's greatest mysteries. We have walked through misty highlands, crossed sun-scorched deserts, and stood in the ruins of magnificent cities, all to uncover the secrets of those who said no to an empire. We hope these stories have ignited your curiosity as much as they have ours. We would love to hear which of these kingdoms you find most fascinating. Was it the ingenious Nabataeans of Petra, the formidable Dacians and their mountain gold, or perhaps the persistent Picts beyond the wall? Share your thoughts and questions in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this exploration into the past, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure into the mysteries that shape